In this story, an ambitious and courageous knight is destined to die on the battlefield. He once believed that someone like him, whose talents awakened, flourished, and took root in war, could start a new life. In that new life, he imagined he could finally have a family, something he desperately longed for. Unfortunately for him, it was nothing more than an impossible dream. The knight kneeling before us is none other than the famous Agrick of the Drenic Empire, the protagonist of our tale. His final opponent is another great knight named Duke Termion, one of the 6 Exa-class knights of the Ultion Empire. Even Agrick understands the weight of this challenge, especially after feeling the crushing pressure of the black aura that engulfed the battlefield after just a single day. Duke Termion finds it fascinating that Agrick remains steadfast, even knowing he faces one of the 6 Exa-class knights. He even laments that it is a shame to end the life of such a brilliant talent. But Agrick is far from surrendering. He rises to his feet, swings his sword defiantly, and declares that he was born on the battlefield, and there he will die. The two warriors begin to walk toward each other, their sheer auras throwing the area into chaos. The Duke points out that although Agrick is brave, there is still a trace of regret in his eyes. Termion continues, saying that Agrick could have been a formidable rival in the future. Then he charges his sword with energy and rushes at our hero, expressing hope that when Agrick gains a new life, he can let go of his regrets. With that, the Duke swings his blade. Before he draws his last breath, Agrick reflects on the war between the Drenic Empire and the Ultion Empire, which has lasted for many years. His mother was a victim of that war. He had been just a newborn when she died in the surrounding chaos, leaving him alone in this tumultuous world as an orphan. While other children played with toys and read books, he struggled to contribute to the war and fight for his kingdom. At 14, he was forced to take up a sword and was sent to his first battlefield. He fought bravely, and in that moment his talents awakened. The manhua in his heart amplified his movements and senses to levels he had never imagined. He began to rise through the ranks of the knights and amazed everyone by taming 3 manhwas, becoming a quad-core warrior with 4 cores. His dream of joining the 5 extra-class knights of the empire was finally within reach. He believed that this final war might bring peace to his weary life. So he fought his last battle valiantly, thinking he was on the verge of achieving everything he had ever wanted, until Duke Termion arrived. The Duke's mere presence caused everyone to scatter. Back in the present, the Duke's first strike shatters Agrick's sword into pieces, and his dream disintegrates before his eyes. The Duke's next blow pierces his heart. Agrick reflects that all he ever wanted was to create a family, but that hope is lost. The stab hurls him across the battlefield, and he crashes hard to the ground. The impact splits the earth around him as he slides, bloodied and broken. As he begins to lose consciousness, everything fades into complete darkness. But the veil of darkness lifts as he opens his eyes. The first thing he sees is a couple trying to play with him, or rather trying to play with their child. Agrick quickly grows impatient as he hears them calling him their son. His father lifts him up with a wide smile and calls him Dame, telling him he must become a fantastic swordsman and follow in his father's footsteps. His mother, named Dane Sogress, quickly snatches him from her husband's arms, insisting that Dane will become an extraordinary assassin instead. Her energetic husband, Dane Sogress, and his wife argue over which career their son should pursue, while Dane feels shy and confused by their debate. Apparently they are traveling by carriage toward their home, and the discussion continues the entire trip. Lily believes that infiltrating the shadows to assassinate targets and escaping unseen is far more exciting, while the father insists that the spear is the most beautiful and complete martial art. Such is the life of our hero. Just when he thought he was lost on that battlefield, he miraculously finds himself reincarnated. The twist in his story is that he is now in the Ultion Empire. His former enemy is the youngest son of a certain count. When the carriage finally stops at the mansion grounds, his parents reach a compromise and decide they will teach him both skills, but Lily still does not give up, stubbornly declaring that her son will become an assassin, while Arkan merely laughs, insisting that Dane will be a lancer. The carriage driver nods to signal their arrival, and both parents pause their debate for the moment. Confused that they had already arrived, the couple realized they must have lost track of time while arguing. The husband quickly stepped out of the carriage and offered his hand to help his wife down. She felt a little embarrassed and asked what the castle staff might think if they saw them. He laughed softly and said he only wanted to hold his wife's hand. Why should that matter? With that, he guided his beautiful wife out of the carriage, while Agrick couldn't help but feel awkward seeing his father act so submissively. Eventually his embarrassment faded as his eyes widened, taking in the grandeur of the castle. As they finally entered, Lily couldn't help but notice how happy Dime seemed to be back home. And why wouldn't he be? With a house like this and such wealthy parents, it would be easier for his talents to develop than he had ever imagined possible. 2 months passed after that day. We now find Lily talking to her son, who had begun to babble. She was delighted that he was finally making sounds, while the boy was equally fascinated to experience babbling for the first time, something he had never heard before. You see, chances to meet small children had been rare during his time wandering the battlefield. The few children he saw were often swaddled and crying with nowhere to go. Many mourned parents who had slowly succumbed to destruction and vanished. Compared with that, his new home was fortunate and prosperous, and he was relieved that he would not go hungry here. Suddenly, his father burst into the room with excitement, holding a spear in hand. He proudly announced that it was called a spear. Our boy was not exactly a fan of his father's enthusiastic side. He found it hard to believe that this man, his father, was the strongest exact-class lancer of the empire. Known as Dane Sogress, although he hardly looked like a war hero, he was in fact one famously called the Blue Tornado. His wife became irritated and started pushing him away from the child, asking how he could enter their son's room with something so sharp. The man began to lose his composure under her intense gaze and timidly said he only wanted to show it to them, but she radiated a deadly aura, reminding him that she had already said they would not teach their son anything until he reached an appropriate age. It was no surprise that this grown man trembled under her piercing eyes, for his wife was the greatest assassin in the empire. She argued that if he continued like this, she would also teach their son the fundamentals of stealth while he was still young. Arkan tried to argue that everyone was investing in early education these days. Even one of the famous magic houses, known as the Teleport House, placed a staff next to a child as soon as they were born. But his wife grew annoyed again and asked if a spear now looked like a staff to him. Meanwhile, our boy reflected that the reason his parents placed such importance on his future was that his 2 older sisters had chosen careers unrelated to spear fighting or assassination. Soon we see his 2 sisters playing with their little brother, making his cheeks ache. One of them, Arabella, laughed that his chubby cheeks were the cutest thing ever. While Arabella overflowed with energy, his sister Claire was the complete opposite, nervous and calm. She shyly offered to teach him summoning later, saying it was a useful skill to have. Like Arabella, Claire was a talented girl who excelled at summoning. She had managed her first summoning at the age of 7 and could now handle 2 summons at the same time. Arabella teased Claire, telling her to touch him and insisting he was very soft. Claire hesitated, unsure if she should. Meanwhile, Dime acted adorable and friendly, reflecting that he had initially thought Claire did not like him. Now he realized it was more like jealousy. After all, he was the youngest in the family now, stealing all the attention. Eventually, Claire reached out and gently touched his nose. She was thrilled and exclaimed at how soft he really was. She touched him again and promised to teach him everything when he grew older. Dime couldn't help but think it was a bit over the top, how everyone wanted to pass their own specialties on to him. His father was an exact-class lancer. His mother was a talented, though retired, assassin. His eldest sister was a genius mage, and Claire was a gifted summoner. The house of Count Sogress was the perfect noble family, the ideal family he had always imagined. He wondered whether there was any reason to seek revenge in this new life. Of course his death had been tragic, but that battlefield was just that, a battlefield. It was almost amusing to think about revenge now. To take revenge on someone who defeated him fairly now seemed pointless. The whole family gathered in the grand hall, debating with one another and trying to convince each other that their own specialties would suit Dime best. Watching this warm argument brought a smile to Dime's face. This was the kind of family he had always wished for, and he felt happy to have been born here. But as tempers flared and voices rose, he began to wonder if this was truly what a harmonious family looked like. Soon we learned about a special tradition in the Sogress household known as the ceremony of choice. When a child of the family turns 1 year old, several objects are placed on a table before them and people try to predict the child's future based on the item they pick. Today was young Master Daim's turn. He had just celebrated his first birthday, and now he would choose his path. Guests murmured excitedly, recalling how the older sisters had become a mage and a summoner. And wondering what young Daim would select, they moved toward the ceremonial hall to witness the decision. Inside the great hall, Daim sat near 4 different items, each representing a distinct class. As the crowd gathered around the table, his mother told him gently that he only needed to pick what he liked. Yet Daim didn't seem sure what to choose. He glanced at his father, who was clearly hoping he would pick the spear. His father smiled, convinced that the little boy would be drawn to the dragon-tailed spearhead. This spearhead was apparently crafted from rare Dakran, and when infused with mana it became as sharp and heavy as the energy poured into it. His mother, meanwhile, looked proud and serene, thinking Daim was far too handsome to become an assassin, but she was still certain he would choose the dagger. This was no ordinary blade, it was called the Night Horn, forged from ethereal ore capable of holding every element and storing multiple poisons. Their eldest daughter was equally confident that her little brother would carry on the mage's legacy and choose the enchanted pouch. This was no common bag but a special subspace pouch, usable only by those with magical talent. Claire, quiet as always, wondered shyly if Dad might become a summoner. Before him lay a summoning sigil, a tool for summoners to receive a code aligned with their talent, allowing them to call forth their creatures. But Daim was confused and uncertain, because he could literally hear the thoughts of every family member. After a deep sigh, he finally made his decision. Crawling toward the objects, he stirred a wave of excitement through the crowd. As he picked up speed, his parents and sisters beamed with pride, cheering him on in their own ways. His father encouraged him to choose something strong and resilient, while his mother urged him to pick something short and sharp. As Daim neared the table, a golden light suddenly shone from all 4 items at once. He had no idea what was happening, and neither did his family. The crowd, however, gasped in shock and excitement as they realized that all 4 items had reacted, something completely unheard of. They couldn't help but admit that the young master seemed to be a once-in-a-generation prodigy. Daim was just as astonished. He remembered how talented he had been as a soldier on the battlefield, but in this life he felt he was on an entirely different level. Little Arabella asked her father what they should do since nothing like this had ever happened before. Both parents looked equally bewildered, realizing this meant they would need to teach their son all 4 disciplines. Their conclusion stunned the other guests, while Daim only smiled warmly in response. Time passed and we next found ourselves in a training hall where the sound of clashing weapons rang out. It was none other than Daim and his father sparring. Our boy had grown a great deal since we last saw him. Just 30 seconds ago it seemed. Agrick grinned broadly at his son's impressive progress, proud that Daim had mastered the technique he'd taught earlier. The boy thanked his father, and we learned that Daim was now 7 years old. As they shared a cheerful laugh, a man suddenly appeared, carrying a spear. Daim watched with curiosity as the newcomer presented it. Agrick had clearly been expecting the delivery. He quickly took the spear and offered it to Daim, explaining that this was his birthday gift. Agrick said he had originally planned to present it during the official birthday banquet, but wanted Daim to have it before his mother's gift. He added that he had been preparing this spear for 2 years and had commissioned it from a renowned craftsman in the capital. He wished his son a happy 7th birthday in advance. Overjoyed, Daim immediately set aside his old practice staff and grabbed the new spear, declaring that he would use it because it was simply amazing. He admired how the black shaft and the silver spearhead complemented each other, and he was surprised by how light it felt. His father asked if he liked it, and he replied that he loved it. In fact, he was so excited that he immediately began to twirl it in his hands. His father then asked if he knew the difference between a sword and a spear. Danny explained that, because of the spear's length, it could keep opponents at a distance effectively, and due to its small point of contact it had a high attack efficiency. His father agreed, saying that was true, but warned that as Danny grew stronger, the spear would actually become harder to use than a sword. He pointed out the fundamental problem with spears. To attack properly, you needed to maintain a minimum distance between yourself and your opponent. Still, he told his son not to worry too much, since every weapon had its pros and cons. Even swords, often called the perfect weapon, could be weak in certain situations. Danny brightened at that and promised to remember it. His father then began to spin the spear in his hand and invited his son to train so he could demonstrate something. Danny was completely awed by the power radiating from his father. This was the first time he had witnessed the overwhelming energy of an Exa-class lancer. The magical force his father released was simply staggering. After gathering his energy, his father thrust the spear forward, and the space around the tip began to distort. He explained that the distortion occurred because he had released his magical power while wielding the spear. This technique used the core's ability to concentrate magical power in one place. Danny remarked that he had heard about this from his sister and explained that humans could surpass their physical limits as the number of their mana cores increased, which meant their potential could expand. He reflected that in his past life he had possessed a quadruple core, and all this knowledge came from that previous existence. Meanwhile, his father smiled broadly, impressed by how much his son had studied, and reminded him that he now had 6 mana cores. Naturally, Danny pretended to be shocked, but inwardly he thought that if he had not died, he might have reached 6 cores in his former life as well. His father encouraged him to try the new spear. Danny hesitated, but his father told him to relax his mind, forget his worries, and simply thrust the weapon. Danny agreed, and as he held the spear, he reflected that in his past life he had never been interested in spears. Having discovered a talent for swordsmanship back then, he had used spears only as a secondary option. Now at last it was time to truly try. He took his stance, closed his eyes, and his father noted how good his form already was. Agrick couldn't help smiling from ear to ear. It had taken him 7 years to master this very technique. But since his son was still so young, he wondered if Danny could actually perform it. The moment Dan thrust the spear, reality itself seemed to shift, completely shattering his father's expectations. Agrick was stunned, shouting in disbelief and demanding to know how his son knew so much. When Dan finished the technique, his father approached, laughing and praising him for an impressive performance. Danny explained that, as he thrust the spear, he concentrated his magical power in a single point and infused it into the tip. When the energy reached the spearhead, he cut off the flow. His father was nearly beside himself with excitement, asking if he had formed a mana core. Danny calmly said yes, claiming that while reading a book about creating mana cores, he had decided to experiment and had luckily succeeded. Of course, he was lying. The truth was that he had formed the core while practicing mana breathing. His father knelt to meet his eyes, unable to hide his pride. He was certain that one day his son would become an extraordinary warrior. Danny only smiled faintly, thinking of all the surprises he still had in store that would surely astonish his father. Agrick, meanwhile, wondered whether his son might truly become a mage, a lancer, an assassin, and a summoner all at once. When night fell, Dane's 7th birthday celebration finally began. Guests filled the castle as music and laughter echoed through the great hall. Everyone was enjoying themselves immensely. Among the guests was Duke Bateau, the very man who had killed Dan in his previous life. When Agrick saw him, he called out to start a conversation. Agrick addressed him by the title Duke. Bateau told him to drop the formality and speak as they usually did. As we know, Duke Bateau belonged to the imperial house of Elan and was the head of the Termian duchy. Agrick quickly stepped closer to his friend and whispered that many people were watching, so he needed to maintain the appearance of formality. The Duke chuckled, saying Agrick could do as he pleased, and then asked where his son was. At that moment, Agrick called for Dan and told him to greet the Duke of Termian. The instant Dan heard that name, memories of his past life and of his final encounter with this man came rushing back. When the boy finally stood before the Duke, he introduced himself as Danrys and bowed his head, saying it was an honor to meet him. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Danrys said politely. The Duke laughed, impressed by the boy's manners, and asked the father if Dan was also learning to use a spear. Agrick confirmed that he was. At that moment, a young lady approached Duke Apot from behind, and when Dan's eyes fell on her, he was momentarily surprised. The girl greeted Count Sogress with a respectful bow to show her good manners. She introduced herself as Lala Termian, the youngest daughter of the Termian Duchy. After the introductions, the celebration continued. The guests enjoyed the music and the beautiful night, but the same could not be said for Dane Sogress and Bal Termian. The reason was that the Baroness of Termian remained ill. Despite Bal's best efforts to find a cure or treatment, nothing had worked. Arkan hoped this was only a temporary trial and that his friend's wife would recover soon. Still, Bal warned that if he suddenly disappeared, it would mean his wife's condition had worsened and he would use a teleportation path to return to the capital. For now, though, it was Dan's party, and Dan had quietly slipped away. To Bal, the boy seemed clever and he wanted to talk with him more. Arkan also realized that his son had disappeared, along with Layla. Finding them was easy enough. The two had gone for a walk together. They likely found the formal party as dull as many other noble gatherings. What they were talking about, however, was a mystery to their parents. Layla was especially talkative. To be honest, she disliked following her father to all these noble parties, but this time she was glad she had come. She had heard many times how handsome Dan was, but under the moonlight he looked even better, and she liked this quiet place. Dan was happy to hear that. Unlike the bustling capital, the Sogress family's territory was peaceful and calm. That was why Layla envied him. At her own home there was always something happening. Nobles arrived every day with business proposals and offers for her father. Sometimes even the imperial family appeared, and every single time someone visited she had to dress formally and go out to greet them. Something she absolutely hated. Instead of all that, she wished she could wear something simple and practical and practice with her sword all day. Dan was surprised that such a small and seemingly delicate girl practiced with a sword instead of magic. He himself loved his quiet territory. It wasn't as hectic as the capital, which gave him plenty of free time to train with the spear that he simply adored. Layla was startled at first to learn he trained with a spear, but then she remembered his father's nickname, the Blue Whirlwind, and everything made sense. She had often heard her father speak of how amazing the Blue Whirlwind was. Since Dan practiced so diligently with the spear, Layla assumed he wanted to enter the academy. Yet that wasn't his reason at all, and her surprise was evident when he said so. For her, training hard to get into the academy was the obvious goal. She had heard how incredibly difficult it was to gain admission. Dan, however, didn't doubt for a moment that he would be accepted. He trained simply to become even better once he entered. Layla could hardly believe his confidence, so she asked what he would do if he failed. Even in that case, he said calmly, he wouldn't be upset or give up. He would simply try again. And if he failed a second time, he would take it as a sign that this path wasn't meant for him. Layla found such a carefree attitude toward the future astonishing. She asked if he wasn't afraid of disappointing his family or his home. Naturally, our hero wasn't worried at all. Compared with the hardships of his past life, this was nothing. Layla, on the other hand, couldn't help but envy him. In her family, failure was unacceptable. Although Dan had lived among nobles for 7 years, he was still surprised by how petty they could be about such things. As for Layla, he had no doubt she would succeed. When she heard his encouraging words, she brightened immediately and offered to show Dan her sword skills. Our hero was a bit surprised by her enthusiasm, but there was no stopping her when an opportunity to practice appeared. Layla immediately asked where the training grounds were, and Dan had to guide her there, hoping nothing would go wrong. At the training field, Layla held nothing back. She executed one movement after another like an experienced swordswoman. To an untrained eye, her techniques might have seemed flawless, but our hero was far from a beginner. Watching her carefully, he had to admit that her transitions from attack to defense and back again were impressively smooth, and the timing of her strikes was excellent. But there was one flaw. After a while her movements lost their rhythm, and the fluidity began to fade. Breathing hard after the exercise, a satisfied Layla asked him what he thought of her skills. At first Dan wasn't entirely honest. He told her she had performed wonderfully, and that he enjoyed watching. Layla was quite pleased with the compliment, but Dan decided to be truthful. He pointed out that she still had room for improvement. For example, after the third form she was taking a half step more than necessary, and that extra half step appeared again in the following forms. Those repeated half steps The extra half steps made the later sword forms slightly misaligned. Such criticism left Layla speechless. She looked as if she might cry, and Dane began to wonder if his remarks had been too blunt. He even started to apologize for upsetting her, saying he might be wrong since it had been a long time since he'd watched a true swordsman, but his worry was unnecessary. Layla quickly regained her composure and gripped the sword more firmly. Now she understood her mistake. She repeated the training movements again, and this time they were flawless. Dane's advice had been the missing piece that brought her technique to perfection. Her joy and gratitude were boundless. She even hugged Dane. Our hero tried to resist, but not very successfully. Layla was simply fascinated by how much he knew about swordsmanship. In an instant she realized she had been practicing incorrectly all this time, something her teachers had never mentioned. She promised to remember his help. Eventually she let Den go, almost suffocating him in her arms, but then nearly cut him with the sword as she released him. That little lady really needed a lesson in organization. Den was caught off guard by the sudden embrace, though he couldn't say he disliked it. Of course, their private moment was soon interrupted by the shouts of servants searching everywhere for them. They had already taken enough of a break from the banquet and didn't intend to hide. They hurried back so they wouldn't be discovered at the training field. When they returned, Dane became the center of attention as his parents officially congratulated him on both his birthday and his first manticore discovery. Naturally, they presented him with a gift, a brooch bearing the family crest, similar to those worn by his older sisters. His mother advised him to treasure it, as this brooch would now serve as proof of his status and honor. After his parents, all the guests joined in offering their congratulations. Dane had now officially and truly earned the Sogress name. No one present doubted that he would grow into a good man like his father. Dan's parents were overjoyed, and the young Dan was as well. It was the first time in both of his lives that he had received such warm congratulations from so many people. Suddenly the entire hall trembled. Guests began shouting, unsure whether it was an earthquake or an enemy invasion. Dan also grew concerned, but his father quickly reassured him there was no need to be afraid. Dane Sogress knew exactly what was happening. Although he had hoped for a quiet day, apparently his daughter had other plans. Dan truly had no idea. Lightning flashed near the ceiling of the hall, and within seconds, all portal required at least 5th chain mastery. Dan didn't admire her power so much as he felt irritated by her noisy, dramatic entrance. Yet, as soon as the guests calmed slightly, an enormous creature appeared in the sky, a massive wyvern with a rider. This time Lady Claire had managed to startle the staff and guests alike. She was in a foul mood, but had missed arriving before her sister by only a step. As soon as she entered, guests whispered about her reputation as a brilliant summoner. No one had expected her to command a wyvern at only 16 years old. Finally, they were all home again. Together, the sisters stood before their parents and brothers to wish their favorite little brother, Dan, a happy birthday. After their dramatic entrances, the sisters eagerly handed over their gifts while offering their well wishes. Dan thanked Arabella and Claire for coming home. Even though they were busy with their studies, the girls were excited to watch their little brother open the presents. Duke Arkan nearly cried at the special treatment his son was receiving. His daughters had given him only a letter on his own birthday. At last, Dan opened the box Arabella had brought. Inside was a ring that transformed into a convenient dimensional pouch. She had designed the artifact herself. The subspace magic used in its creation belonged to the highest chain, and Arabella's renowned professor had helped apply it to the ring. It was common knowledge how difficult it was to imbue any item with subspace magic. Arabella gently took her brother's hand and slid the ring onto his finger. She must have spent a great deal of time designing an artifact capable of supporting an entire subspace. She also embedded Dan's genetic code into the ring so that no one but her little brother could use it. It was a truly unique item. Mother Lily examined the ring and saw a faint ripple of mana running through the artifact, proof that it had been crafted with the finest magical stones. Arabella explained that all Dan needed to do was channel a bit of mana into the ring and the subspace would be established. It was far more convenient than ordinary storage bags. The last few small rebel forces were captured, bringing a lasting era of peace for everyone. One bright day, people were excitedly chatting about how the young master Dan had recently visited one of the local shops. They could not stop talking about how the shopkeeper's eldest daughter literally fainted when she saw him. The ladies gossiped among themselves, saying he was getting more handsome every day and wishing they could at least catch a glimpse of his face once. There was even a rumor that he was still single, which gave them a small spark of hope, but a friend quickly reminded them that he was only 14 and told her companion to stop swooning over a boy underage. Another woman mentioned that there were rumors claiming Dan did not look 14 at all. He was already as tall as Count Sogress. Some even said he could easily be mistaken for a young man of 20. Enough gossip. Let's see how our young man has grown. We shift to the outskirts of the county of Sogress, an area infused with ancient magic known as the Forest of the Last Days. Here, Dan is on a special mission assigned by his mother Lily Sogress. We catch a glimpse of him holding a spear in one hand and some kind of cloth, probably a map or something similar in the other. Whatever it is, he has already charted his course. With only 3 hours left before sunset, he knows he must leave the forest before nightfall. He begins his journey, leaping through the trees with the agility of a ninja. The most important thing in this mission is to avoid being caught by his enemies. This time, Dan must dodge traps and escape the forest, which is full of every kind of hidden danger. After leaping for a while, he finally lands back on the ground. He takes a deep breath, absorbing the air and the energy around him, holding it for a moment before exhaling. Prioritizing stealth and blending into his surroundings, he begins to notice concealed traps revealing themselves. He spots thin, nearly invisible threads crossing the area. He knows all the traps will be triggered the moment he touches those wires. Such simple rope mechanisms may seem basic, but that is precisely what makes them so dangerous. Fortunately for him, this one looks easy to disarm. Suddenly, rat-like monsters appear in the clearing. The moment they spot him, they waste no time rushing to attack. It turns out to be an entire pack, which he definitely did not expect here. Even more troubling, the whole group advances on him at frightening speed. Before they hit the cords and set off the traps, he must deal with them quickly. But he hesitates, knowing that accidentally touching a trap could be even more dangerous. Still, there is no time to waste. He starts to run, and as the rats trigger the wires, sharp needles spring out from every direction, impaling the unlucky creatures caught in the setup. It seems that luring the rats into the trap was part of his plan all along, and he is relieved that they fell for it, sparing him the trouble of fighting them directly. But then he notices one particular rat that is still alive. Closing the distance, the monster leaps straight at him. Dan faces the remaining beast head-on. The creature's speed nearly matches his own. The giant rat stops abruptly and lunges again, this time using a ranged attack, spitting a strange substance from its mouth. Dan quickly assesses the situation as the liquid hurtles toward him. He does not know what it is, but it certainly looks dangerous. He spins his spear and deflects the attack with precision. The young warrior grits his teeth, realizing he cannot afford to waste more time defending. Every second is precious. It is time to turn the tables and strike. A blue aura begins to form around his body as he locks onto the target. With a series of incredibly swift movements, Dan demonstrates his impressive mastery of spear technique. He moves freely through the air while perfectly tracking the enemy's position, ending with a clean strike that slices the rat's head neatly in half. Dan does not bother to look at the result of his attack. He quickly departs and continues his mission. By sunset, he reaches the final checkpoint of the test. Completely exhausted and gasping for breath, he fights the urge to vomit. At least he has finally escaped the forest and all its horrors. Suddenly he senses a fierce presence emerging from the trees and worries that his fight is not over. He jumps to his feet, regretting that he let his guard down to rest. Just as he is about to confront the presence, he stops. It is only his mother, Lily. She had intentionally allowed her presence to be felt to test how Dan would react, and he passed. Moreover, his total time through the forest was 3 hours and 30 minutes, even faster than Lily's own record. She had been watching the entire time. After all, a mother cannot simply leave her child alone in such a dangerous place. Lily knew better than anyone how talented her son truly was, but a mother's view is always a little different. Through this trial that Dan had practically mastered, she could not find a single flaw in his survival skills or adaptability. She affectionately pinched Dan's cheeks and remarked that, at the pace he was progressing, he could be recruited as an assassin. To celebrate his successful run, Lily brought out her most prized possession as the greatest assassin in the Empire, her dagger. She believed the weapon would suit her son better now. From this moment on, Dan would be the owner of Nighthorn. Lily cheerfully passed the legendary weapon to her boy, knowing she no longer had any use for it. Nighthorn was forged from the mysterious mineral etriol, a metal capable of taking on the properties of any element. If Dan wished, he could use it to store every poison in existence, allowing the blade to absorb and mix toxins for his own use. Dan sincerely thanked his mother for such a precious heirloom and promised to care for Nighthorn well. This also marked the end of his assassin training with her. Just as they were preparing to leave the forest and return home, the mother and son pair heard a guttural scream nearby. It seemed to come from deep within the woods, so they decided to investigate. A few days later, in the annex tower of the county of Sogress, a man awoke coughing and screaming in terror. He had long white hair and a beard, and looked completely bewildered. The mysterious man struggled to catch his breath after waking from unconsciousness. Finally, he glanced around the luxurious room, wondering where he was. The last thing he remembered was eating a mushroom in that cursed forest. The door creaked open and Dan entered, carrying a cup of water. He warned the man not to move too much, explaining that he was still undergoing detoxification. Dan explained that the old man must have accidentally eaten a poisonous red-nosed mushroom. Fortunately, Dan and Lily had found and saved him just in time. The old man recalled seeing those red-nosed mushrooms but never imagined they were so deadly. Had Dan and Lily arrived even a little later, he would have been dead. Dan handed him the water, knowing how thirsty he must be. While watching the stranger closely, Dan noticed a belt bearing the insignia of the Nixian magic tower. This man was clearly no ordinary traveler. If it hadn't been for Nighthorn absorbing the venom ravaging his body, the old man would surely have died. Once the stranger had calmed down a bit, he asked Dan where they were. The boy honestly replied that they were in the annex tower of the county of Sogress. The old man must have wandered far south before collapsing. He had been poisoned by those deadly mushrooms and somehow made it all the way south. Dan advised him to relax for now and wait for the Count to arrive. He also introduced himself as the youngest son of Count Sogress. The old man perked up with interest when he heard the name Arabella Sogress, the prodigy coveted by every magic tower in the empire. Dan further explained that he and his mother had found the stranger while training in the forest. The old man nearly spat out his water at that revelation. That mad forest had tormented him. Even as an 8-circle mage, he had gotten lost and his mana flow had reversed while he was casting a spell, wrecking his body. The entire forest was saturated with ancient mana, and invisible traps were scattered everywhere. The forest belonged to House Sogress, making it naturally dangerous for anyone outside the family. Moreover, because of the presence of ancient magic, the mana flow there differed greatly from what modern mages were accustomed to. It was truly the worst place for a contemporary wizard to wander. The old man finally realized he really would have died without Dan's help. He also recognized that the boy standing before him might be a once-in-a-generation talent if he was already strong enough to train freely in such a hellish place. Dan had even created the antidote that saved the old man's life, an antidote requiring extensive knowledge and precise preparation. The old man could hardly believe how blessed House Sogress was. With 2 prodigies in magic and summoning already, even the youngest child appeared monstrously gifted. If the continent were still at war, House Sogress could easily become the most powerful noble family in the empire. Grateful, the old man thanked Dan and admitted that he owed the boy his life. He was a little surprised by the youth's calm, confident response but assured him that he always repaid his debts. First, he wished to introduce himself properly. the old man revealed that he was Sadrine Goss, not long ago the head of the Nixian magic tower. Sadrine carried pride in his name and status, inviting Dan to ask for whatever reward he desired. The young man only smiled at Sadrine's modesty. Dan could tell this elderly mage was likely one of those wanderers who survived without a permanent home, storing everything they owned in a personal subspace. Sadrine in turn was unsettled by Dan's composure after such an introduction. Normally people reacted with shock or awe. Most people would have felt intimidated in the presence of the head of a mage tower, but the boy showed no fear. Trying to reassert his status, Sadrine urged Dan to ask for whatever reward he desired, without holding back. The young man paused for a moment, as though considering his next words. Sadrine smiled, eager to prove his generosity and reliability, but Dan simply requested more time to think about his reward. He gave Sadrine no satisfaction with his calm, indifferent answer. Dan turned toward the door and wished the mighty mage a quick recovery, advising him to rest a bit longer. When the boy finally left the room, Sadrine just sat on the bed, stunned. This was the first person to treat him as though he were merely an ordinary magician. Originally the old mage had planned to leave after a day or two, but now that would not be the case. He had just found a fascinating child in the south and wanted to learn more about Dan. Later Dan casually explained to Herman who Sadrine really was, and the attendant eagerly clarified that 8 circle mages sit at the very top of the magical hierarchy, the elite of the elite. This meant an extraordinarily influential figure now owed Dan his life. On this continent, magic towers function almost like independent nations, sovereign in their own right, that made Sadrine an immensely powerful person. Still, it remained a mystery why the head of a magic tower had been wandering through the forest in the first place. But then again, that was no ordinary forest. Mages called it the Forest of the Last Days, a forbidden zone. The name alone made it clear that it was not the kind of place ordinary people should ever attempt to enter. Dan glanced at the sword in his hand and asked Herman to procure a new one for him. The blades he had been using had become too light and short for his growing body. Fortunately, the Count had brought back an entire collection of weapons as spoils of war. Tomorrow Dan could begin training with a proper longsword. For now he would finish his current practice session using only the lighter blade. Thinking further, he remembered the crest that Duke Termian had once given him, a free voucher to have any weapon forged to his liking. 7 years had passed since that day. Looking back, Dan recalled those times with fondness. If he ever traveled to the capital, his first stop would certainly be the Duke's territory. After training, Dan met his father outside the practice hall. He had expected his father to be busy with affairs outside the castle, but surprisingly the Count had returned earlier than planned. Matters abroad had concluded sooner than expected, and the Count had hurried home to meet the head of the magic tower recovering in one of the guest rooms. He hoped that Sadrine could perhaps help, since Arabella would soon need a skilled master. Dan even considered asking the mage to guide his sister, though he was not sure the old man could handle her fiery temperament. He had heard that Arabella once punched one of her veteran instructors for being annoying. In any case, Count Sogress praised his son for doing the right thing and saving a life. Dan insisted he had merely done what anyone should, but it was still an act few could accomplish. He had truly grown into an exceptional young man. Over the years, it had become harder and harder for the Count to even glimpse the faces of his daughters. Ibebela had finished her extended semester and was now selecting a magic tower to join, while Claire had been appointed an assistant professor. Such was the cost of having extraordinary children. Of course, Claire and Arabella were exceptional in their own right, but the Count also held high expectations for his only son. He often wondered how the world would react to a man of such wide-ranging talents. The Count looked forward to the day when his rival Balt Termian would witness how much Dan had progressed. Years had passed since Dan's reincarnation as the son of House Sogress, but the thought of crossing swords with Duke Termian still filled him with determination. He also wondered how Leela was faring in the capital. Her last letter had arrived perhaps a year ago, and Dan was eager to see what she was doing when he eventually passed through the city. A few days later, Sadrine began complaining that he was going stir-crazy staying in the guest room. He still had not fully recovered. The physician advised him not to venture far and strictly forbade him from using magic. His mana reflux had yet to be cleansed, and the poison in his body had not been fully neutralized. He would need to rest and recover for some time. Still, Sidrin had little choice. It had been ages since he was forced to live without magic, and this situation was certainly a change of pace, but he could not bear to remain shut in all day. He left the room despite being unfamiliar with the annex. The physician feared the old mage might cause trouble, and if anything went wrong, the doctor would be held responsible. In the few days Sidrin spent drifting about the guest quarters, the housemaids began spreading rumors about the eccentric old man. People often said that mages were either geniuses or lunatics. Some of the maids reported seeing Sidrin wander up and down every floor of the annex dozens of times. Now he was simply standing in the garden, staring at flowers for hours on end. The servants had heard that the old man was supposedly an incredibly powerful mage, but all they had actually seen was a crazy old eccentric. They worried about what he might do next. Lady Arabella's garden left Sidrin completely enchanted. He had never imagined that the estate could possess such extraordinary magic. Dan approached the old man, having searched everywhere only to find Sidrin in the garden. Sidrin was not particularly interested in staying confined in a foreign place until he fully recovered, but everyone wanted the best for him. Still, he felt compelled to step outside. The area was certainly a perfect place to rest and heal, and he understood why so many nobles traveled south when the holiday season began. Dan loved the south as well, which made it a shame that he would soon have to leave. Curious, Sidrin asked the young man where he was headed. Dan replied casually that he would be going to the capital soon. Sidrin assumed the boy was planning to attend the academy. After all, both of his sisters were prominent figures in that prestigious place. While the daughters of House Sogress were famous for their extraordinary talents, Sidrin was far more curious about Dan's own abilities. Imbuing mana into his eyes, the archmage decided to take a closer look. Within the boy's body raged a torrent of pure roaring power. Sidrin's eyes widened. He had never seen mana so dense. The sheer concentration of energy was unprecedented. If the geniuses of Dan's age could be compared to a gentle stream, then Dan was a raging river sweeping away everything in its path. Normally, such immense magic inside someone so young would be unstable and on the brink of exploding, but that was not the case here. Dan quickly noticed the old mage's attempt to assess his mana without permission. He called him out on it, startling Sidrin. The elder awkwardly stopped, praised the boy for his keen perception and apologized, admitting that his intrusion had been unwise. Inside, however, Sidrin struggled to comprehend how Dan managed to contain such wild power. In all his years as an archmage, he had never encountered another like him. Puzzled by the old man's reaction, Dan wondered what was happening. Sidrin was so focused on the sheer density of Dan's mana that he nearly overlooked something even more shocking. The boy had no magic circle. With mana that intense, forming a circle should have been effortless. The old mage's face twisted in horror as he realized the apparent tragedy. Looking deeper, he discovered that Dan possessed 2 mana cores. It was incredible enough to develop even 1 core at such a young age, but Sidrin was furious that the boy had chosen this path. To him, possessing such overwhelming mana only to wield a spear was sheer madness. Sidrin believed that creating multiple mana cores instead of a magic circle was a form of sacrilege. In his eyes, the young man had turned his back on the greatest magical potential the archmage had ever witnessed. Confused by the reprimand, Dan asked if he could simply use both mana cores and magic circles together. This only made the old mage more frustrated. Holding his head in exasperation, Sidrin struggled to explain the severity of the situation. He asked the boy if he knew why the lifespans of magic swordsmen were so short. It was because they possessed both mana cores and magic circles simultaneously, 2 forces that constantly interfered with each other. When they collided, disaster followed. It had become an unspoken rule of the magical world. Compressed mana from the core would inevitably flow into the circle, and a circle unable to handle such overwhelming power would shatter. Dane understood the basic concept, but had no idea how dangerous it could truly be. Cedrine grew gruff at the thought of such talent being wasted on spear training. Concerned, Dan asked if it was truly impossible for him to practice magic without a circle. Cedrine explained that while not impossible, refining mana without a circle to cast spells requiring purified magic was theoretically improbable. Many had attempted this path, but every effort Cedrine had personally witnessed had ended in failure. Yet Dan remained undeterred. Though he had never tried it properly, he simply felt that he could cast spells without the refinement of a magic circle. Cedrine thought the boy was out of his mind. Wasting no time, Dan began manipulating the magical code he already knew. As he rearranged the runes and symbols in the air, the process flowed smoothly. With the code successfully modified, he produced a fire spell that erupted with considerable force. All doubt vanished as he realized it worked. It was only a basic first-tier spell, but he had cast it without a magic circle. Cedrine's jaw dropped in shock. Common sense dictated that anyone without a circle should be incapable of casting spells. In all his years overseeing the Nixian magic tower, he had never seen anything like it. Dan continued refining the magical code and formed a mana barrier around his body. He explained that Arabella had discovered his high affinity for magic and wondered aloud if this, Arabella thought, might be the reason he could accomplish such improbable feats with mana. Perhaps that was true, but what Dan was doing went far beyond mere theory. Cedrine Goss had stood at the pinnacle of mages for a very long time, yet for the first time he felt what ordinary folk must experience when confronted with the supernatural abilities of the elite. He was witnessing a natural talent that shook the foundations of reality itself. Meanwhile, Dan was simply amused that he had managed to make the spells work. The old archmage's knees trembled with excitement. Dan's affinity with mana was unmatched, his energy pure and denser than anyone else's in the world. The boy was truly extraordinary, a once-in-a-generation prodigy. Cedrine could no longer contain himself. He immediately asked Dan if he would like to become his personal disciple. The elder worked hard to persuade the boy, convinced that ignoring such talent would be a disservice to the world. Dan, however, grew weary of the old man's persistence. When Cedrine asked whether he knew any two-chain spells, Dan admitted he had never been exposed to double-chain magic codes and therefore could not cast higher-level spells. Cedrine laughed and boasted that, if Dan became his disciple, he would be able to cast 8-chain spells in no time. Still, Dan politely refused the invitation. Cedrine's patience began to fray. At that moment, Count Sogress intervened, laughing at the archmage's eagerness to be so close to his son. When asked what they were discussing, Dan answered honestly. The old man kept trying to take him on as a disciple, even after several refusals. At least Cedrine knew how to behave properly in front of the head of the house. He praised Dan's potential to become a great mage, emphasizing that the boy's future was brighter than anyone could imagine, especially since he could already use chain-level magic without a circle. As a warrior himself, the Count understood how unbelievable that was. By this point, he had almost stopped being surprised by his son's superhuman abilities. The young man lacked even the basic knowledge of spellcraft, yet he could cast spells naturally. The Count also commended the former head of the magic tower for immediately recognizing Dan's gift. But the word talent alone was not enough. Dan was a genius who might truly become an unparalleled magic swordsman. When the Count heard that phrase, however, his cheerful mood vanished and a quiet fury filled the air. The title of magic swordsman did not sit well with Dane Sogress. Dan flinched, knowing that Cedrine had just uttered a word that should never be spoken in front of his father. Failing to notice the change in atmosphere, Cedrine kept pressing the idea of Dan becoming a magic swordsman. He even promised to take full responsibility and turn the young man into the most powerful fighter in the empire. By the time he sensed the Count's rising anger, it was already too late. Count Arkan shouted at the top of his lungs that his boy would not become a magic swordsman. Cedrine argued that combining swordplay and magic would be the perfect path for a genius suited to both arts. Arkan retorted again and again that his son would never be a magic swordsman. If anything, he would be a magic lancer. Finally understanding the problem, Dan stayed as quiet as possible while his father calmed down. Poor Sidrin had never encountered a family as unusual as the Sogresses. Among mages, taking on a disciple carries profound meaning. Powerful sorcerers typically choose their successors through an act known as inheritance, a tradition passed down from ancient times to the present. Even after universal magical education became common, what Sidrin sought was not merely a disciple but a true heir to his life's work and the legacy of those before him. The fact that an 8-chain archmage was still desperately trying to recruit him gave Dan enormous confidence in his own talent and potential. He felt a strange, stirring sensation within himself. Now more familiar with the fundamentals of magic, he remembered a gift Arabella had given him a few years earlier. A crystal ball he could use to see his sister whenever he wished. At this moment, seeking Arabella's opinion might be wise. Dan retrieved the crystal ball and infused it with his mana, calling to his sister telepathically. She was studying in the academy library when she suddenly heard his voice, and was pleasantly surprised. Arabella immediately set aside her work and smiled with delight at her little brother's contact. As expected, even Arabella was shocked to learn that Dan had managed to cast a one-link spell without a magic circle. She had always known his affinity for mana was abnormally high, but she had never imagined it could reach such a level. The circle, after all, serves only to purify and channel energy. Perhaps Dan's mana was already pure enough to be used in its raw form. To test this, Arabella decided to send a mana stone through the transmission device in Dan's room to examine the purity of his power. It was a relief for Dan to have Arabella helping him with these matters. She was already an established 6-chain mage, and her support had been incredibly comforting. Arabella believed that since Danny could already use chain-level magic, attracting attention at the academy would be inevitable, but that was the last thing he wanted. Still, it could not be avoided. True talent always draws the eyes of the masses. Arabella assured her little brother that she would completely crush anyone who dared to bully him. Speaking of bullies, Danny asked his sister about the rumor that she had broken the nose of a senior student, the second son of the Duchy of Duel. Just thinking about that clingy nuisance made Arabella bristle with irritation. Realizing she was taking the call in a public space, she forced herself to calm down. In any case, with enough time, she theorized that the purity of Dan's mana would continue to increase, one of several possibilities they could consider. Unfortunately, their discussion had to be cut short when a professor called for her. They said their goodbyes and she promised to send the previously mentioned mana stone. The realization finally hit Dan. He might be walking a path that had never existed before. With the extraordinary purity of his mana, he even joked that perhaps the heart of a dragon was beating in his chest. Meanwhile, Sakrin was still confined to the annex to recover. Using a bit of mana to inspect Dan had worsened his magical reflux, meaning he might have to stay longer. If only the boy would accept his offer, he could inherit the most illustrious legacy among mages. Sakrin wondered how he might entice the young man to join him if Danny wasn't even interested in learning 8-chain magic. Perhaps he should offer some grand, priceless artifact, or pass on a refined inheritance handed down through generations. But if he gave away his treasures too quickly, he might be left with nothing. While he was racking his brain for ideas, Dan knocked on the door. Sadrine wondered if the boy had come to apologize or perhaps even changed his mind about the offer. Dan explained that he had something he wanted to discuss. The old mage immediately assumed the young man had reconsidered becoming his disciple, but Dan quickly put a stop to that notion. It wasn't that he lacked interest in magic. Sadrine asked if Dan already had a master and that was why he kept refusing, but that wasn't the case either. Thinking he was being toyed with, Sadrine asked what the boy really wanted to say. It was simple. Danny still didn't know the rearrangement code for 2-chain magic. Learning from his sister would be difficult since she was far away. In the end, the best method would be to learn from Sadrine himself, a literal archmage. After all, the old man still owed him for the rescue, so refusing such a request outright wasn't possible. Dan admitted that he didn't want to follow only the path of a mage. He wouldn't become just a magic lancer. He also wanted to be a magical lancer summoner assassin. As far as Sadrine knew, something that outrageous didn't even exist. To make it worse, Dan added swordsman to the list as well. The absurdity of the boy's aspirations completely exasperated Sadrine. To reach such a complicated title, Dan had to set his own limits and refused to become the disciple of the former head of the magic tower. From the young man's determination, Sidrin could see that Dan's mind was made up. Then an idea came to the old mage. He stood and asked if Dan would be interested in a letter of recommendation. Since the boy aimed to enter the academy, receiving a recommendation from the former head of the magic tower would be a tremendous boost to his reputation. Danny thought about it briefly and realized it was by no means a bad offer. He accepted the letter of recommendation and while they were at it, made another request. Sidrin chuckled quietly to himself, thinking the young man had finally come around and that he could at last begin to secure influence over an unparalleled genius. Seeing the old man in a generous mood, Dan asked if he could also learn the rearrangement code for two-chain magic. That would not be a big problem for someone like Sidrin, who knew the rearrangement codes for all existing two-chain spells. After all, Danny was still young. Giving him a recommendation letter for the academy and a few two-chain magic codes was no great burden. Although Sidrin wasn't in peak condition, he could begin the lessons immediately. Dane smiled slyly to himself. He had just scored a major victory. Extending his hand, he declared that with everything settled, they could consider Sidrin's debt for being saved fully repaid. The old mage himself had said that, since he owed Dan great gratitude, the boy could ask for anything, and here Dan was, asking for exactly what he wanted. Sidrin actually enjoyed being manipulated in this way, convinced he was finally getting a disciple, but Dan's answer to his invitation remained the same, a firm, resounding no. The old man had been outwitted by a 14-year-old. Refusing to give up, Sidrin insisted that the boy had requested 2 favors when he was owed only 1. The young man disagreed, however, standing by his clever bargain. The very fact that this was more convenient than normal dimensional bags made the artifact priceless. From what Dan remembered, such a tool was something only the wealthy used on the battlefield. Only commanders of noble origin and high-ranking mages possessed such a convenient power. The ring would also grow as he aged, adapting to his body. Danny tried channeling his mana into the artifact, and a green portal opened in front of everyone. The Duke was stunned to see his son accomplish this with such ease. Claire, Duke Beltermian, and Layla were amazed by the brilliant display of magic. Dan managed to open a subspace faster than Arabella had years ago. He was a genius, there was no doubt about it. It would be a groundbreaking achievement if he could cultivate both a mana core and a magic circle at the same time. After the magical demonstration, Claire approached her little brother and handed him her gift. Dan opened it slowly, thanking his older sister sincerely. Inside the wooden box was a peculiar-looking egg resting on a soft cloth. Confused, he picked up the egg and asked what it was. Claire panicked and warned him to be careful with it as it was no ordinary egg. Everyone in the family was curious about the strange present, but Claire revealed its secret only to Dan. She whispered that it was a familiar. She had obtained it by accident while trying to summon Decaron. Even Claire herself didn't know what would hatch from it, but everyone in the world understood how precious a familiar could be. Danny tried to imagine what might emerge from the mysterious egg. He had heard of familiars before. Unlike regular summons, they were an entirely different entity. Once summoned, a familiar could remain permanently in the real world. Claire instructed Dan to keep the egg a secret until it hatched. He promised he would. All the whispering between the two irritated Arabella, who felt left out. As for Claire's instructions, Danny was to pour a bit of his mana into the egg once in the morning and once at night so it would recognize him as its master. Lily was simply happy that her little one was receiving such incredible gifts. It showed how much the siblings cared for one another. With the exchange of presents complete, Duke Arkan cleared his throat and reminded his daughters to at least greet their parents, since they had arrived at the party after saying they might not be able to come. Realizing they hadn't spoken a word to their parents since their arrival, the girls awkwardly greeted their father. The Duke was a true softie when it came to his daughters, so he didn't mind. He was just happy to see them again. Since leaving to pursue their professions, the girls rarely returned home. Duke Arkan was delighted to see them looking well. From a distance, Layla watched the Sogress family being so lovingly loud and joyful with one another. The girl couldn't help but compare her own family situation to theirs. Danny noticed her watching and turned his head. He saw the drop in her mood as she quietly stepped away. He wondered why she seemed so lonely and sad in the middle of a lively crowd of nobles. The banquet ended, and the next day arrived. Duke Buttermond stayed the night and was now walking through the Sogress territory. He couldn't stop thinking about how incredibly talented Arbella Sogress was. As expected of the top mage of the academy, her magical talent was unmatched. She might be the perfect match for the son of Duke Termion, the academy's best swordsman. If the Sogress and Termion houses could unite through a marriage between the two, it would create a faction powerful enough to rival even the imperial family. If that happened, no one could challenge either house or their children. So Duke Termion decided to raise the question of engagement between their eldest children in today's conversation with Arkan. On his way to meet the other Duke, Termion heard the sound of clashing steel nearby. It came from the training grounds. Someone was honing their technique incredibly early in the morning. Of course, it was Dan, fully focused on refining his spear skills. He had become truly deadly with the weapon. With years of training under his father and an intense work ethic, he was long ready for combat. Dane's concentration was unparalleled. He moved with the fluidity and precision of a veteran warrior, striking multiple lethal blows as he darted across the training field. He increased his speed even further, intensifying his rhythm. Finally, his arms blurred as he delivered countless spear thrusts in a short span of time. Curiosity got the better of Duke Termion, who ended up watching the boys training from a distance. He was pleasantly surprised to see the youngest son of House Sogress pushing himself to the extreme. With his experienced eyes, the Duke could discern how incredibly refined Dane's technique was. His movements and focus were nothing like those of a 7-year-old boy. Even his simplest strikes were honed to a terrifying degree. Everything was executed with perfection that veteran spearmen with years of battlefield experience could still learn from him. When Dane finally finished his last sequence, he was breathless. Duke Termion was completely impressed from start to finish. What he had just witnessed seemed impossible. He had heard rumors. The rumors about the young Sogress possessing incredible talent, even as a baby, had always seemed like exaggerated gossip to Duke Termion. Now he knew those rumors were true. After a brief pause, Dane resumed practicing, this time focusing on his movements and posture. As one of the strongest swordsmen in the region, the Duke could not help but notice that the boy's stance and movements resembled those of a master swordsman. He began to consider that the child might have learned swordsmanship at a high level at such a young age. Eventually, Dane sensed someone watching him from the doorway. He brandished his spear, ready to strike, and warned the observer to step out instead of hiding. Duke Termion, excited yet embarrassed, realized he had been discovered by a mere boy, not his proudest moment as a seasoned warrior. The more he thought about Dane's footwork, the more strangely familiar it seemed. He was certain he had seen that same pattern somewhere before. The Duke stepped forward and apologized to Dane for eavesdropping on his private training session, insisting he meant nothing suspicious. Seeing that the onlooker was Duke Termion, Dane felt guilty for speaking so sharply. Though he had lived in this body for 7 years, this man was still the one who had defeated and killed him in his previous life. Remembering his etiquette training, Dane greeted the Duke formally. Duke Termion confessed that he was fascinated by the boy's morning training and apologized again. But Dane held his ground, replying that he was forgiven. The Duke found amusement in the child's courage to speak as though they were equals. Now that he was closer, Termion noticed that the boy's body showed no signs of fatigue or trembling despite the intense workout. At the same age, the Duke himself hadn't even formed a single manticore. The Duke complimented Dane's excellent thrusting attack, remarking that the boy had clearly inherited Arkan's talent with the spear. He also admired the craftsmanship of the weapon. Dane thanked him formally, and the older man smiled. This child was not only a lethal fighter but also knew exactly what to say at the right moment. In comparison, his own son had possessed neither such skills nor such manners at age 7. This brief encounter led Duke Termion to seriously consider arranging a marriage between Layla and Dan as well. Casually, he mentioned that his daughter had also been training in swordsmanship. Since they were of similar age, he suggested they look out for each other when they entered the academy in the future. Dane responded politely, and the Duke enjoyed the boy's forthrightness. Finally, Duke Termian excused himself so as not to interrupt Dane's training any longer. But before leaving the practice hall, he could not resist one last question. He wanted to know whether the boy had also trained in swordsmanship. Dane made a small mistake in front of the Duke. Ol quickly recognized those subtle tells. Dane answered that he had only read a few manuals on basic swordsmanship and had never trained formally. The Duke still found it odd that he sensed something like a raw battlefield instinct in the child, but common sense dictated that an inexperienced boy could not possess such a killer's intuition. At last the Duke took his leave and Dane escorted him to the exit. Before departing, Duke Termian invited Dane to visit him if he ever came to the capital. The seasoned swordsman had taken a personal interest in the boy's talent. Dane wondered whether the man remembered him. Just thinking about defeating the one who had ended his life before made his blood boil. If he built a solid foundation and prepared step by step, he was certain he could surpass the Duke. One of his life's goals was to defeat the powerful Buttermon Termian in this lifetime. Continuing his training, Dane lost track of time, and Hernan, his attendant, had to come fetch him. Hernan had been silently watching the boy from the shadows, always ready to meet his needs. With Hernan's quiet presence, Dane realized that this man might have enough talent to learn assassination and stealth skills himself. Everyone was busy preparing for the second banquet of the celebration. Some nobles had already begun to arrive. Gathering more than 30 noble families on the exact date was no easy task. As for Dane's sisters, they had already opened a teleportation portal and returned to the academy together. They had midterm exams coming soon. For now it was time for Dane to wash up and dress. He made a mental note to examine more closely the gifts his sisters had given him the night before. After his intense training, Dane was bathed, dressed, and ready. He entered the family hall with his mother and father and mingled with the various nobles. Throughout the evening, he had to put his etiquette training into practice while conversing with high society. As the birthday boy, he was the center of attention, with every eye upon him. Finally, he managed to slip out of the banquet hall to catch his breath. The life of a noble was exhausting. His schedule was busier than usual because it was his birthday, but at least Dan could always find comfort resting in his beautiful garden. Mr. Garner had worked hard to cultivate this special place into a scene of peaceful beauty. Dane gazed at the flowers in full bloom, bursting with unique colors as butterflies danced around them. He remembered his older sister explaining how flowers held more natural mana than most things. Since he had a bit of free time, he decided to analyze the mana in those flowers. Closing his eyes, he focused on the natural flow of magic in the air. Without opening them, he began to grasp the concept his sister had described. He started to feel the mana within the flowers. Though he had been training in several disciplines, he had not seen notable progress in wizardry or summoning magic. He struggled to decide which field deserved his time. Having too much talent could be a curse at moments like this. He was practically suffering from success. After a few minutes immersed in the garden's natural mana, he finally sensed the energy inside the flowers. He could hardly believe something so small could hold such a powerful current. If one could feel the flow of nature and somehow make it their own, that principle could settle into the body to form a magic circle. That was exactly what was happening now. It helped that his body's mana affinity was already tremendous. He could clearly see what others might only sense vaguely with a sixth sense. Just a single visit to the garden had sharpened his mana perception enormously. What he had barely seen before now became crystal clear. He was on the verge of understanding the inner workings of magic when he suddenly felt something shatter. Meanwhile, two noble children had also wandered into the garden, bored of the adults' small talk in the banquet hall. They were brothers. The older, a redhead, was irritated that no one was paying attention to him. As everyone spoke of the Sogress genius, he stomped aggressively across the flower beds, crushing blossoms as he went. Lost in the vast garden, the red-haired brothers stumbled upon Dane, who was standing quietly, distracted. They glanced at his clothes and mistakenly assumed he was a servant, shouting at him. He did not appreciate such disrespect. The arrogant older boy even had the audacity to order Dane to guide them out. Dane saw what they were doing to the flowers and shouted at them to stop trampling the plants. The red-haired brute felt offended at being scolded. Dane asked why they were destroying the flower beds instead of using the proper garden paths. The older boy, seeing how small Dane was, continued his annoying behavior. Next came the inevitable display of the family name. As all young nobles did, Dane didn't care. To him, they were just a pair of bullies ruining his garden's flower beds. The red-haired boy didn't like being called a brute, yet he acted exactly like one, grabbing Dane by the collar. They were sons of Count Tyron, a guest of the castle. Hearing that name stirred Dane's memories of his past life. That man had been the noble he captured after a humiliating battlefield defeat. Dane remembered Count Tyron as an irritating aristocrat, a true scoundrel. Based on the behavior of the bully before him now, the phrase "like father, like son" felt perfect. The red-haired brat kept flaunting his family name, bragging that they were famous in the capital. He even boasted that his house could make Dane disappear without a trace, so he'd better watch his words. Dane knew plenty of fools like this boy from before. He also knew words would never penetrate the thick skull of this red-headed idiot. The boy raised his fist to strike Dane, still thinking he was merely abusing a servant. Dane had no intention of letting that happen. Instead, he responded by slamming his forehead into the boy's nose with full force, a critical hit that nearly broke it. The younger brother shouted in alarm, checking on his older sibling, who was sprawled on the ground after the blow. Seeing the blood on his hands, the red-haired boy panicked as if he had never bled before. When he realized it was his own blood, his temper flared and he threatened to kill Dane. Finding the threat amusing, Dane calmly challenged him to try. The red-haired brat wanted blood for blood. His younger brother, showing more sense, tried to stop him, but the older boy was too arrogant to listen. The brute threw a punch, but Dane easily dodged, leaping back. It was a complete mismatch. Dane was far too quick and slippery for an amateur. As he let the red-haired boy tire himself out, he noted the sloppy footwork like someone who had never even held a weapon. Dane guessed the boy might be a mage or a summoner. The barrage of punches continued, none of them coming close to touching a single hair on Dane's head. The bully's nose kept bleeding as his patience wore thin. Dane, meanwhile, toyed with his opponent, using his superior movement, and then an idea came to him. Perhaps he could take advantage of the flow of magic that he remembered the mana he had sensed in the flowers earlier, and decided to incorporate his will into it. If he succeeded, he would be able to compress that force into a physical form. This fight was the perfect opportunity to test it. The younger brother of the red-haired bully watched with his mouth wide open as Dan planted his feet firmly and began gathering magic in his hands. He visualized a ball of pure mana and launched it straight at the older boy's stomach. The force was powerful enough to knock the red-haired brat painfully onto the grass, even cracking the stone path along the way. The boy screamed in agony, his body and pride both wounded. His little brother hurried to check on him, but Dane was more concerned about the ruined flower bed than about the bully's well-being. Yet the red-haired boy was tenacious. He still had enough strength to stand again. Seeing that Dane could use magic, the brat demanded to know who he really was. The younger brother kept trying to discourage the elder, but the boy's pride was too wounded for him to care about consequences. The redhead summoned Manhwa within his own body and began to open some sort of sinister portal. Dane was surprised to witness such a familiar scene. This was the magic of a summoner. Mana swirled and condensed until a translucent wolf began to descend to the ground. The beast looked bloodthirsty and predatory, bearing sharp fangs as it growled. The red-haired boy laughed maniacally as he called his summoned creature JP. He finally introduced himself as Digran Tyron, ready to show Dane the consequences of challenging someone of his status. Digran ordered the wolf to tear Dane apart, but Dane remained unimpressed. Compared to the terrifying creatures his sister Claire could summon, like her mighty wyvern, this wolf was hardly worth noticing. As JP lunged, Dane simply locked eyes with the beast and didn't move. Somehow the wolf seemed to sense it would meet a horrible fate if it attacked. It abruptly turned and spun around, its aura changing completely as its aggression melted away. The Tyron brothers were stunned. Degron's proud summon had apparently betrayed him. The great wolf now behaved like a submissive puppy before Dan. Degron shouted frantically, ordering the creature to rip Dane's throat out, but his commands fell on deaf ears. Instead, the wolf wagged its tail happily at Dan. Sensing no malice from the summoned beast, Dane gently patted the good boy, though even he had no idea why this reversal had happened. Thinking back, he realized that even Claire's summons had always been unusually friendly toward him. Her wyverns sometimes played with him as well. He had assumed it was only because of their shared bloodline, but this situation with no family ties involved proved otherwise. It likely meant he possessed an abnormally high affinity for all kinds of summoned creatures. Whatever the case, Degron's favor with his own summon had clearly collapsed. Degron could not comprehend what was happening. He had never heard of a summon betraying its master. Dane was winning on every front, and continued to provoke Degron to come closer. The younger brother practically begged his sibling to stop embarrassing himself, but it was no use. The poor boy was so frightened he wet his pants. He cried while Degron cursed him as a disgrace. Dane twisted the knife in their pride by casually pointing out that the castle's main basement had a bath. Using his little brother's accident as an excuse, Degron finally retreated. As if he hadn't already humiliated himself enough, he ordered Dane to stay in the garden before fleeing. Dane merely watched the pathetic loser with disgust. Degron didn't even take his own summoned creature with him. Left alone, Dane resumed experimenting with his new understanding of mana. He practiced a trick Claire had taught him earlier, identifying the faint remaining link between Degron and JP. With care, Dane severed that weak bond, and rewrote it with his own magic. In doing so, he and the wolf became officially connected. Without ever performing a formal summoning, the boy had accomplished an intricate feat simply by leveraging his extraordinary affinity with summoned beasts. He had now effectively become a summoner. While he was savoring this quiet triumph, Dane heard a familiar and irritating voice calling for him. Degron Tyron had, in fact, gone to fetch his father and was now tattling that he had been bullied in the garden. He pointed at Dane while pinching his nose to stop the bleeding, whining that the boy had struck him and stolen his summon. The formidable Mulgar Tyron, head of the powerful Tyron family and one of the great nobles of the capital, strode forward with blustering energy. He demanded to know whether Dane had truly beaten his son and taken control of his summoned beast. Our young hero was not the type to back down from a pompous noble. He stood his ground and calmly admitted what he had done. He realized that Mulgar Tyron was far fatter now than when he had once captured the boar as a prisoner. Clearly the peaceful times had treated him well, even though he had been a disgrace on the battlefield. Mulgar continued to throw his weight around, declaring that he could not let this matter slide. No one could meddle with his children and expect him to ignore it. The pompous man fired off a barrage of demanding questions and finally insisted that the boy reveal his identity. Our young hero lifted his head proudly and introduced himself formally as Dane Sogress, youngest son of Dane Sogress, Lord of the South and head of the noble Sogress family. It was a presentation worthy of a royal court. That single introduction left both father and son dumbfounded. They had unknowingly insulted the birthday boy himself, and had no idea they were provoking one of the most promising rising stars of Sudak. Mulgar was stunned to encounter the youngest son of House Sogress so unexpectedly. Thinking of the great noble houses, Mulgar recalled how he had once been taken prisoner by Agrick and had contributed nothing of value during the war, a humiliation that made the other nobles laugh at him. Now he saw a perfect opportunity to turn the situation to his advantage. He planned to tarnish the Sogress name and use it as a pretext to demand mining rights. Soon the very nobles who once mocked him would be bowing before him. With that scheme in mind, the blustering man turned back to the boy and asked if he was indeed the birthday celebrant. Dane, my friend, simply nodded in confirmation. Mulgar could barely contain his frustration. He certainly had not come here to celebrate some child's birthday. He pointed to his unruly son Degron and demanded to know how Dane intended to compensate for the humiliation he had caused. Dane, he said, had not only injured his son, a guest of House Sogress, but had also stolen his summon, a serious crime. Degran eagerly agreed with his father's accusation, sneering that this would be Dane's last day. The overfed noble then threatened the boy, saying he would personally speak with Count Sogress and hold him responsible for his son's actions. Dane calmly acknowledged the tirade but stated firmly that before anyone went to his father, Degran should apologize first. That infuriated Mogar, who demanded to know what nonsense the boy was talking about, while Degran ground his teeth in rage. But Dane stood his ground. He explained that yes, he had struck Degran and hurt him, but it had been in self-defense against a threat to his life. Moreover, he had not stolen the summon. Genpu had chosen to follow him of his own will. The spoiled son protested loudly, insisting there was no way Genpu would ever do that and accusing Dane of lying. At that moment Mogar paused to think. He remembered hearing that the second daughter of House Sogress was a prodigy in summoning. It seemed entirely possible that she had taught Dane how to break the bond between a summoner and his beast. The corpulent man went back and forth with Dane, who found the exchange increasingly tiresome. Eventually Mogar decided to calm himself after so much bluster. Even his jaw was starting to ache. He finally said he would not scold Dane further, and declared that they should hear what Count Sogress himself had to say. As if summoned by the very conversation, the Count arrived on the scene accompanied by Duke Termian. Naturally, both the ill-mannered son and his overbearing father were stunned to see the Count in person, and even more surprised that the Duke was with him. As night fell, the red-haired boy gave his testimony to the Count, claiming that he and his little brother had simply gotten lost in the garden and asked Dane for directions. He spun an elaborate story saying that Dane suddenly head-butted him and mocked him with strange magic. To scare Dane, Degran claimed he had called his summon, but Dane somehow stole the creature and counter-attacked. When Degran finished, Mogar stepped forward saying he only intended to give Dane a warning. Still, he insisted that stealing someone's summon was clearly wrong and could not be overlooked. At last Count Sogress spoke, telling Mogar that he would not pass judgment after hearing only one side of the dispute. He wanted to hear Dane's account before making any decision. To reassure Mogar, the Count added that if Mogar worried about bias, Duke Termian would also give his opinion. The Duke quickly offered a slight smile and said that if the matter was truly so important, he was more than willing to help settle it. Mogar's frustration deepened, and sweat began to bead on his round face. Mogar Tyron was sweating profusely. He knew he was about to be in serious trouble. Bringing Duke Termian into the matter only made things more complicated. And he felt a growing sense of dread. Count Sogress gave his son a small nod to speak, and Dane prepared himself, explaining that what Mogar's son had said was not entirely accurate, though some parts were true. He went on to describe how the flowers they had so carefully cultivated in the garden were trampled, exactly as he had claimed earlier. He had simply told Mogar's son to leave, which enraged the boy and started the fight. Both the fat noble and his son were stunned by this blunt truth, the younger even trying to deny it and calling Dane a liar. But the Count urged Dane to continue. Dane explained that when Mogar's son summoned Genpu, his command had been to kill. He clarified that he never stole the summon. Genpu had approached him first, sensing his goodwill. The Duke was astonished that this 7-year-old boy spoke with such grace and carefully chosen words. Dane repeated firmly that he had not stolen anyone's summon. Mogar lost control, stamping his foot and calling the claim absurd. He insisted it was impossible for a summon to submit to someone who was not a summoner, accusing Dane of using some shady technique. Unbothered, Dane replied that he possessed an innate affinity with summons and that a creature not truly bonded with its master could indeed yield to someone like him. Mogar refused to believe it, but Dane calmly stated it was the truth. Mogar's face twisted as if he were suffering severe constipation, and he barked that the boy was making it all up. At that point the Duke stepped in, suggesting they settle the matter with a direct test. Count Sogress turned to his son and asked if he was willing, and Dane agreed. Meanwhile, Mogar shot his own son a deadly glare for creating such a mess. The insolent boy looked terrified, knowing he was about to face his father's wrath, especially since he had no idea how to summon Genpu again. When he tried, he failed completely, prompting his father to shout at him as expected. Dane, on the other hand, only smiled, knowing he had already severed the original bond. There was no way Degran could summon Genpu back. Dane then offered to demonstrate by summoning Genpu himself, but added that he would need the summoning sigil that Degran held. The spoiled boy bristled, questioning Dane's audacity in demanding his sigil and spouting nonsense, but Count Sogress interrupted. He reminded Degran that, according to his own words, even if Dane used the sigil he should not be able to summon Genpu, so there was no harm in allowing the attempt. Malgar sweated harder, realizing he had no choice, and reluctantly told his son to hand it over. The red-haired boy was nearly in tears, but his father ordered him to hurry. As soon as Den received the sigil, he began his spell. He explained that a summoning sigil carries a unique coded name of the summoner, which normally prevents anyone else from using it. However, since Genpu was already imbued with Den's mana, the sigil was merely a vessel, and Genpu was now connected to him. When Dane called for Genpu, the creature appeared instantly and happily licked his cheeks. Both the Count and the Duke were amazed, while Mogar and Degran trembled, exposed as liars. The Duke found it incredible and wondered aloud whether Dane was also training in swordsmanship. His father confirmed it, though he admitted he was not entirely sure of the boy's full abilities. The fat noble, meanwhile, realized his plan had completely collapsed. The Count turned to him and asked if he now acknowledged that Dane had spoken the truth. The flustered man quickly tried to act calm, laughing and admitting that perhaps they had misunderstood and thought Dane had stolen the summon. He also claimed that his son had never intended to kill Dane, and he asked the boy to confirm it. Degran trembled but agreed, saying he only meant to scare Dane. Our young hero, however, burned with anger at how these scoundrels were trying to escape responsibility so easily. Before either of the High Lords could give their final judgment, a lady entered the scene, startling everyone, especially Dane, whose eyes widened when he saw Layla. As she approached, she declared that what Degran had said was not true. Her father quickly asked why she was there, and she replied that she had heard voices while taking a walk. Before continuing, she politely greeted the Count and the fat noble. Mogar stammered in surprise, clearly caught off guard by this unexpected encounter with the Duke's daughter. Count Sogress went straight to the point, asking Layla about her claim that Degran was lying. She confidently confirmed it, saying she had indeed overheard their earlier conversation during her stroll. Degran began to panic, realizing she might have heard everything. It's definitely not good news for Pekka Lel. She continues explaining all the juicy details, and my friend can't help but smile at this unexpected turn of events that somehow works in his favor. Sometime later, the fat man tells his foolish son to hurry up and apologize to Count Sogress. The son mutters quickly, saying he was wrong, but the Count tells him to apologize to Dan instead. The chubby man quickly pushes his son toward Danny, telling him to apologize at once. The spoiled boy looks uncomfortable and hesitates before stammering a weak and insincere apology. Danny, however, is far from satisfied. He realizes that the apology is not genuine, merely a required gesture, because the lie was uncovered after an outside witness appeared. Danny does not really want to accept such a feeble apology, but remembering his past experiences, he decides to be the more mature person. Instead of being stubborn, he resolves to show a little generosity. With that in mind, Danny accepts the spoiled boy's apology, and the boy brightens with happiness, thanking him eagerly for letting him off the hook. Meanwhile, the fat father also lets out a sigh of relief, realizing how close he came to losing everything. On the other hand, the Duke, who may become Dan's future father-in-law, cannot help thinking that he already knew Dan was a special boy. After all, Dan could easily have been stubborn about the whole situation, considering that the other side was clearly in the wrong from the start. Finally, the Count makes it clear that since Dan accepted the apology, there will be no further discussion of the incident. However, he emphasizes that he had no intention of letting it go, especially because Dagon attacked Dan with the intent to kill him. The fat father starts to sweat as he sees how furious the Count is. When he tries to speak, the Count orders him to be silent and commands him to take his family and leave the castle immediately. The news shakes the fat man to his core. If he is expelled now, his reputation will be ruined, and he is desperate to stay in the castle. No matter what, he grabs the Count's hand and begins to beg for forgiveness, saying he will do anything. Sogress asks if only he will pardon him this time, but the Count quickly pulls his hand away, making it clear that he has no need of the man. He says the soldiers will arrive soon to escort him out. With that, he begins to leave the scene furiously with his son, while the fat man remains behind, desperately pleading for forgiveness. Sogress also tells Duke Termian that it is time to go, and the Duke promptly calls his daughter as they start to walk away. As they leave, Dan turns his head to look at them, feeling satisfied that they are getting what they deserve. After all, they were the ones who started all this trouble, so it is only fair that they reap what they sow. In any case, he has learned something important today. His father can be quite frightening when he is angry. The Duke Termel then asks Dan if it is true that he defeated that spoiled son of Mogard with a mana bullet, and Dan quickly confirms it. The Duke cannot help but highlight how talented Dan is, not only in spear fighting but also in summoning and magic. It is truly impressive, and he is certain history has rarely seen such talent before. Dan's proud father smiles, saying that he too is proud to have such an exceptional son. Meanwhile, Dan simply absorbs all the praise, while Layla is stunned, struggling to believe what she is hearing. The Duke Termian then points out that, although talent is important, Dan is also incredibly calm. Most children tend to get agitated during fights, and stubbornly insist that they are right, but Danny does not do that. The Duke has no doubt that this boy will grow into a great man. Dan's father gives him a light pat on the head, saying it is too early to be certain. They will have to wait until he is fully grown to see how things unfold. He also points out that it is all thanks to Layla that the incident was resolved peacefully. Without her testimony, things could have turned very ugly. When the Duke Termian hears this, he is quite surprised that the Sogress family holds such a positive view of Layla. He does not let the opportunity slip by and tries to minimize her role in the incident, suggesting that if the Count values her so highly, perhaps they should begin discussing marriage. Of course, Sogress is startled to hear this, and can see how eager the Duke is to marry off his daughter. To escape the situation, he quickly changes the subject, noting that the sun is already setting and it is almost time for the banquet. With that, he rushes away, saying he will meet them in the hall. Termel then tells his daughter to return calmly with Dan. He quickly runs after the Count, saying that he wants to have a short conversation with him, leaving the two children behind. As they walk, Layla turns to our boy and asks why the summoned creature ignored its summoner and obeyed him instead. She says that she has seen many famous summoners duel in the capital but has never witnessed anything like that. Dan shrugs and admits that he is not sure either. It just happened. Of course, Layla makes an annoyed face, realizing that Dan is intentionally hiding the truth, even though she was the one who helped him out of that mess. His friend remains indifferent and reminds her that he also helped her once, mentioning the time he assisted with her fencing. Layla thinks back to that moment and reluctantly agrees that he is right. Finally, Dan decides that since they have helped each other before, they can do it again. He tells her that she is free to ask for anything. Immediately, the girl brightens with excitement and exclaims that she wants to learn something right now. Dane is surprised by her impatience and wonders what could be so urgent to learn. He asks what she wants to learn, and she quickly says that she wants him to teach her how to use a mana bullet. Dane asks why she is so eager to learn the mana bullet, and Layla quickly replies that she wants to become stronger and faster. She hopes to form at least 2 mana cores before entering the academy. Dane wonders why she is in such a hurry when she is still so young. He gets his answer as soon as she reveals that she wants to grow stronger to make her mother happy. Her mother loves her very much, and Layla is sure that becoming stronger will make her proud. Hearing her mention her mother, Dane remembers overhearing adults talk about Countess Termian being bedridden. With that in mind, he feels he has no choice but to help her. Layla bursts into a small dance of joy and declares that she is ready to start training tomorrow, though she would not mind beginning tonight, especially since she is unsure how long she will stay at the mansion. Dane simply shakes his head and tells her she can start whenever she wishes. He assures her that once she understands the flow of magic, learning the mana bullet will not be too difficult. Layla then asks eagerly what he will want in return for teaching her. Dane stays silent, which makes it clear that the request he has in mind will not be as simple as merely showing someone how to use magic bullets. The scene then shifts to the banquet hall, where guests whisper and murmur among themselves about that fat man, Tyrone. They have heard that Count Tyrone was expelled from the castle, and everyone wonders what he did to deserve it. Some guests mention that Tyrone's eldest son caused some sort of incident by fighting with young Master Dane and ended up receiving a lesson. They laugh among themselves, amused by the idea of the fat man coming here only to be humiliated and embarrassed. News has also spread that young Master Dan is an exceptional summoner. One guest wonders if this means the Sogress household will now become a prestigious house of summoners. However, another interrupts, saying that is not all. The young Master Dan can also use magic, which many find hard to believe. We then see a large mustached man introducing himself to Dan as Baron Open. He asks our boy if he happens to know anything about the open territory in the east. Dane bows his head humbly in respect and replies that he has heard the territory is famous for its grilled trout and sapphires. The man laughs heartily and admits that Dan is absolutely correct. He continues, saying that the trout and sapphires of House Opened are the best on the continent. Next, he gently pushes his daughter forward, saying that he almost forgot to introduce her. The girl steps ahead and introduces herself as Sylvia Open, greeting him politely. Dane is surprised to see her and nervously returns her greeting, giving his own name. I have no idea why he is so nervous around her, but it seems we will soon find out. She moves closer to him with a mischievous look on her face and whispers that she heard he is the one who will inherit the Sogress household in the future. Dane responds awkwardly, but Sylvia enthusiastically tells him to stop pretending ignorance. She says she has heard that he is talented in many ways and bluntly declares that she will be under his care from now on, especially because there is a chance they may become family in the future. And there it is, the reason for Dane's nervousness around her now makes perfect sense. This girl is simply very direct, and she did not hesitate for even a moment. Just then, Layla enters the scene while Sylvia is still in the middle of shaking Dane's hand. Unsurprisingly, Sylvia is startled to see a potential rival, while Layla practically shoots daggers at our boy, demanding to know who this young lady is. Sylvia recognizes Layla immediately and greets her warmly, introducing herself as the eldest daughter of Baron Opened. Layla tries to return the gesture, but the anger on her face makes it clear that she is far from pleased. Although she says it is a pleasure to meet Sylvia, the two young ladies exchange smiles that practically radiate hostility. Watching them reminds Dan of a memory, and he can clearly see that both are absolutely ready for a fight. Eventually, Layla grabs his hand and announces that she is borrowing him for now, since he already had a prior commitment. She gives him a piercing look as she asks if he remembers their plans. Of course, poor Dane has no idea what she is talking about, but he agrees anyway, apologizing to Sylvia and promising that they will talk again later. Sylvia forces a smile and tells him that they will definitely speak again soon. As Layla leads Dan away, Sylvia cannot help but feel irritated that this girl has taken him from her. Layla, on the other hand, she still hasn't calmed down. Layla is absolutely furious at the audacity of that girl trying to take Dan from her. Dan finds himself stunned under Layla's piercing gaze. He cannot help but think it ironic that the beloved daughter of the Duke, who holds the second greatest power in the capital after the Emperor, cannot compete with the young lady of an Eastern baron. It is no surprise that Sylvia simply gave up. Once Dan and Layla are outside, she immediately starts pressing him about his connection with Sylvia. She wonders if there is a chance that he might become engaged to her, but my friend quickly dismisses any such relationship, insisting that they were only greeting each other. Layla brightens at the thought, and even Dane notices her sudden change in mood. After a short walk, they finally reach the secret spot that only Dane knows. He is confident that no one will disturb them here. As soon as they enter this hidden place, Layla lights up and begins a joyful dance, delighted by the beauty of the location. She is also relieved to know that no one will see them if they do anything there. Dane agrees, saying that she is absolutely right. This is a perfect place to train. Before starting the practice, he asks if she has ever felt mana before. Layla admits that she has sensed a little, though not enough to form a mana core. She mentions that she tried to absorb mana by breathing. Her explanation reminds Dane that she is not yet at the emission stage. He himself learned to sense mana naturally on the battlefield, so he is surprised that a noble house taught her this method. He decides to begin with something simpler and tells her that the first step is to feel the mana she is absorbing. Layla looks a bit confused by this. Dane explains that if she wants to release mana from her body, she must first learn to control the mana within. The most important part, he says, is imagination. He instructs her to close her eyes and imagine mana swirling inside her. After a few moments she tries, but nothing happens. Dane can see from her expression that she did not fully understand the instructions. Layla tries again, but once more nothing occurs. Frustrated, she complains, but Dane reassures her that this is normal for a first attempt and asks her to focus again. Meanwhile, Count Sogress is secretly watching the two children. He cannot help feeling proud that his son is already teaching someone, even at such a young age. It truly makes him believe that Dan has grown up. At that moment, Duke Termian quietly approaches Sogress and asks what on earth he is doing there. Sogress's heart nearly stops at the sudden question, but the Duke quickly says there is no need to be startled and teases him, asking if he is spying on two lovebirds enjoying some private time. Count Sogress raises an eyebrow and asks what he means by lovebirds, and how he even got there. The Duke laughs, amused that the Count was really trying to hide. He then reminds Sogress that he did a rather careless job of sneaking around, especially considering that his wife is the legendary assassin of the Empire. Poor Sogress has no idea what to say after being caught spying, while the Duke jokes, warning that if the master of the castle goes around snooping in other people's affairs, gossip will spread. Naturally, the protective father grows irritated and defensively says that he was only following his son. The Duke laughs at this and cannot help pointing out that he too was simply following his daughter. It turns out both parents are incorrigible. They stand side by side, behaving like a pair of teenagers trying to peek at young women outside a school gate. Meanwhile, with the children, Dane opens his dimensional bag, and Layla is fascinated to see that he already owns something like that. When Dane mentions that his older sister made it for him and gave it as a recent gift, Layla begins to feel jealous. Unlike him, her older brother stopped paying attention to her once he entered the academy. Dane then takes a mirror out of the dimensional bag, and the curious girl casually asks what they are going to do with it. He explains that he brought the mirror in case it helps. It is easier to picture something in the mind while looking at one's reflection than by relying on imagination alone. He tells her to stand in front of the mirror so that she can see herself completely. The girl quickly positions herself in front of the mirror and begins the magical exercise again. This time, Dan notices that she is taking it seriously. She breathes deeply while both loving parents crouch silently on the ground nearby, sitting cross-legged like schoolchildren. The Duke cannot resist pointing out that Layla seems to like Dane. Sogress asks if that is really the case, and the Duke explains that it is, because it is unusual for Layla to get along with someone so easily. Sogress remarks that she seems like a bright child. Duke Termian falls silent for a moment before speaking, saying that she is only bright on the outside, and he cannot say the same about what lies within. He explains that after her brothers went off to the academy, her mother became bedridden, so they could no longer spend time together as before. This situation has made it difficult for Layla to open up to others, and that is what has been happening. The Count points out that if the Duke already knows everything, then why does he always act so cold toward his daughter? Termian is genuinely moved that the Count noticed such a thing and admits that he is doing it on purpose. He explains that when he raised his older children, he gave them too much attention and they grew up spoiled. But Sogress reminds him not to assume that Layla will share the same fate. She will be hurt if she finds out, and now it makes sense why she asked Dan for help instead of her own father. Termian then playfully points a finger at his friend, teasing him for continuing to complain like in the old days. The Count quickly asks when he ever did that, especially since everything he just said is true. The Duke changes the subject, asking when the Count plans to send his son to the capital. He suggests that if he decides to send him, the House of Cow will open its doors wholeheartedly and allow the boy to stay at the imperial castle. Sogress stays quiet and glances back at his son. Seeing how happy he is, the Count simply says that he will do as Dan wishes. His son is free to choose his own path, just like his older sisters. Nearby, Miss Sogress watches the two affectionate fathers, clearly embarrassed by how openly they are spying on the children. Eventually she only smiles, realizing that the love they have for their kids holds a strange power over them. She decides not to spoil the moment and pretends she saw nothing. Back with the children, Lilia thanks Dan for his help and calls him a true genius. She admits that while everyone around her calls her a prodigy, she feels like a weakling compared to him. As Dan casually looks around to see if both parents have quietly left, he reassures her that this is only the beginning and that she will definitely grow stronger as well. She then asks if he plans to attend the academy, since it is the one place where all the geniuses of the empire gather. He replies that he is not sure yet and is not convinced that he needs to go there, as he believes he can become very strong simply by training on his own. The girl criticizes his narrow view and reminds him that attending the academy is not only about studying, it is the gateway to forming a noble faction and the best way to build connections from a young age. Danny is impressed that she understands the real world so well for a 7-year-old. He finally responds to her argument, saying that he already knows this but simply is not interested in the academy yet. There is a mountain of books he has not read in the library, and he still has much to learn from his parents. Lilia acknowledges that this is true, but she asks if he does not want to play with other children his age, especially since she heard that his older sisters are also attending the academy. It seems Dan is running out of arguments against her persistence, so he tries to end the discussion by saying that he is thinking about going in the future if he feels like it. She then tells him to visit her house when he plans to go to the capital, and they promise to meet again. Speaking of meeting again, she remembers to ask when he will make his request now that he has taught her to use mana bullets. He simply shakes his head and says that he will tell her when he goes to the capital. This shocks her, and she lets out a loud cry of disbelief, probably because she realizes he truly intends to go to the capital. Finally, the day of her departure arrives. When Lilia's carriage begins to roll down the road, Danny looks at a stone-like object in his hand, a gift from his future father-in-law. The scene flashes back to the moment when the Duke gave him this mysterious item. When Danny asked what it was, the Duke replied that it was his birthday present and that he hoped Danny would like it. He further explained that the symbols of the Termian house are the sword and the forge. Their family history began with their ancestor, who was a blacksmith. Thanks to him, their house owns the finest forge in the empire. In fact, the greatest forge on the entire continent. All the weapons crafted by the Termian family that protect the empire are made there. Of course, our boy already knows all of this, because according to his past knowledge, every type of ore in the world can be found in that forge, and all kinds of weapons and mystical artifacts are created in the greatest forge on the continent. The Duke then revealed that if Dan presents the insignia at the forge, they will create a weapon of his choice for him. That is when we finally learn that this stone-like object is essentially an insignia, a certified token that proves the honor and skill of the one who possesses it. Count Sogress is absolutely stunned to see the Duke give away such a precious insignia, something even the imperial family covets. The Duke simply pats his future son-in-law on the head and tells him to grow up well and help his father. His potential wife waves a final goodbye, and that is how they part. In the present, Dan's mother kneels beside him. After seeing his downcast face, she asks if he is upset because they have left. He admits that he is, saying that Lilia was practically his first friend. His mother reassures him, saying that once he goes to the capital he will be able to see her again and that he will look even more handsome by then. Well, I suppose his mother is right, since he cannot stay here forever and will have many chances to see her again in the future. So he wishes her happiness until they meet once more. Meanwhile, as the Duke travels in his carriage, his mind remains occupied with thoughts of Dan. He finds it strange that every time he looks at the boy he remembers that warrior Agrick who displayed the skill of a triple-class fighter at such a young age. He is certain that if Agrick were still alive, he could have become one of the Empire of Dranico's elite knights. That is why the Duke hopes to see Dan again when the boy has grown stronger. A few days later we see our young man sitting alone in front of the egg. He has been feeding the egg with mana every morning and night, and now he wonders if it is too early for it to hatch. This egg contains a mysterious familiar, and even if someone is not a summoner, they can infuse the egg with their mana and mark themselves as its master before it hatches, allowing them to control a summon that would normally remain only temporarily. Dan knows that the quality of his mana must match that of the familiar and that there are probably many complicated conditions still unmet. He has heard that some eggs never hatch because their conditions are never fulfilled, so he hopes that is not the case here. Even after changing the flow and strength of his mana, there is still no reaction. After making another great effort, he puts the egg back, thinking he is being greedy to expect success all at once. Suddenly, the butler appears at the gate asking if Dan is ready. At that exact moment, the egg begins to react and makes faint noises. Danny quickly runs toward the egg, certain he just heard something. The butler rushes into the room as well, asking about the sound. Danny tells him to wait a moment while he checks the egg first. However, once again he is disappointed, realizing that he was excited for nothing because he cannot feel anything different. The butler asks whether the egg showed any reaction, and Dan replies that it did not, saying it was probably just his imagination. When he finally enters the training hall, he begins practicing his swordsmanship. After noticing Dan's flawless movements, the butler is delighted and impressed. He applauds while asking when Dan learned fencing. Danny simply dismisses the question, saying he just wanted to swing the sword a little. The butler showers him with praise, calling him a genius who is talented even with the blade. As Dan looks at the sword, he reflects on how fun it was to learn to wield a new weapon like the spear. But he also wanted to handle a sword. Unfortunately, he had been unable to use one all this time, as his father always watched him closely. Fortunately, he is pleased to find he has not lost his touch. The butler quickly hurries off to fetch some snacks and returns with a full tray of treats, telling Dan to eat something before resuming training. Meanwhile, Count Sogress stands by the window, lost in thought. He feels a bit tired from organizing this banquet every year, but at least he has learned that many nobles are now paying attention to the south. Most of them are eager to build a good relationship with him, which is a pleasant change. Since the war ended, the south has enjoyed wonderful weather and luxuries that nobles simply cannot resist. Perhaps their interest should have been obvious from the start. Still, even with all this attention, it pales in comparison to the interest Dan is receiving. The conflicts with the eldest son of Count Tyrone were beyond Sogress's expectations, but Danny handled the situation with remarkable maturity. He calmly and logically explained everything to the adults, which was extremely impressive, and he demonstrated his talents with confidence. The Count cannot help but think that his son is a bit too mature for his age. At times he wishes Danny would act more like other children and relax a little. As the clock nears the time for training, he knows it is time to head to the training hall. He draws the legendary dragon tail spear and decides to let Dan handle it for a while today. But as soon as he steps onto the field with the spear in hand, he freezes when he sees Dan brandishing a sword. Now he is curious as to why his son is using a blade. He immediately thinks back and becomes convinced that the meddling Duke must have said something to him. Otherwise, there is no way Dan would be wielding a sword after all that training with the spear. He simply stands there, watching his son perform incredible maneuvers with the weapon. Seriously, Dan seems to know exactly what he is doing. The strength and precision he shows are enough to challenge even experienced fencers. This makes his father wonder when Dan learned all of it. One thing is certain. Dan is definitely talented with the sword as well. The Count finally calls out to his son, asking when he learned all these impressive moves. It seems that Dan's closely guarded secret has finally been revealed, so he decides it is probably best to tell his father the truth. He admits that in fact he never formally learned any of it. Hearing this leaves his father even more perplexed, making him wonder if this is yet another hidden talent. He begins to think aloud about how Dan already knows how to handle a spear, perform magic, and even master the skills of an assassin, summoning, and now swordsmanship as well. He adds that if it were anyone else he would never believe a child could show talent in all of these areas. Then he asks Dan if he is curious about the world beyond these walls. Dan looks a little confused, unsure of what his father means. His father explains that if Dan wants to explore what lies outside, he should go ahead. He truly believes this country may be too small for his son's vast talent, and if Dan remains here, it will be his own loss. Dan feels a wave of sadness as he realizes his father has accepted that he cannot hold him back forever. Finally, Dan says he would be happy to learn about the world beyond. His father smiles at this and quickly gets to the point, saying that it is time to prepare his son to step into the real world. He admits it is bittersweet to see him leave, but he knows he must respect Dan's wishes. He presents the spear to him, saying that he has brought something special today. It does not take long for Dan to realize what it is, and his father removes any remaining doubt by reminding him that this is the dragon tail, the spear that reacted to him on his very first birthday. He extends his hand, encouraging Dan to take it. The moment Dan grasps the spear, it begins to react and he feels an incredible surge of power coursing through the weapon. His father laughs, saying it is reacting even more strongly than it did when Dan was only a year old. Honestly, who could blame it? He then proudly tells his son that he plans to have him master the spear before he leaves, so he had better be prepared. He promises Dan that one day the dragon tail will be his, but first he must become strong enough to wield it with pride. Dan eagerly promises to work hard and honor his father's teachings. Later, back in his room, Dan's mind swirls with thoughts of the outside world. He has always been curious about it, even during those long days on the battlefield. As a soldier, all he really knew was war, setting up camp, cleaning weapons, eating bland food, and preparing for the next fight. The only way out was for the war to end or for him to die in battle. Honestly, those felt like his only options. But now, with the chance to live a normal life before him, he can hardly imagine what life beyond the battlefield might be like. Still, as Dan, he knows he must embrace this opportunity. He has no idea how his talents will be used, how the world will receive him, or what he might achieve out there. But for the first time, he has the chance to travel, explore, and accomplish anything he sets his mind to. At first, all he wanted was to stay and enjoy the warmth of this place. Yet, thanks to his father's question, his thoughts have changed, and he has finally decided to venture out. The idea excites him. While he is lost in these thoughts, his mother suddenly appears in his room, startling him for a moment. He asks when she came in, and the deadly assassin jokingly reminds him that he was so deep in thought he did not even hear her knock. He suspects she is blatantly lying after all. She is an assassin and likely slipped in silently. She asks if he is truly curious about the world beyond their country, and he answers yes, saying that his father mentioned it would be a waste of his talent to stay here. After thinking for a moment, he admits that he too is curious about the outside world. He begins to apologize to his mother, but she hugs him, saying there is nothing to apologize for. He reminds her that his sisters are not around, and expresses his worry about leaving for the outside world. She reassures him that she is fine with it because she knows how extraordinary his talents are. She adds that even if he did not want to go, the world outside would eventually call to him. She admits it would be wonderful if he could stay longer with her, but the world will not allow that, so she encourages him to go and chase what he desires. He promises that even after leaving home, he will return many times to tell her everything he sees in the world. His mother thanks him and says it seems she finally needs to teach him a few things before sending him out into the world, just as his father is preparing to do. When he asks aloud what kind of teaching she means, his mother cheerfully says she will train him in everything related to assassination. She goes on and on about all the skills and knowledge she possesses. Dan cannot help but think this will lead to some seriously exhausting days before he even departs. In the end, she tells him she will teach him a great many things, and he assures her that he will do his best to learn. As he looks at her, he cannot help but think about the special lessons with his mother that will be filled with her unique kind of love. Many years pass and the scene shifts to the southern region of the Altian Empire, the county of Sogress, a place known for its warm climate and abundant natural resources. This land has become a cornerstone of the empire, helping it remain strong during the war. Thanks to the magnanimous rule of Count Sogress, it is a region filled with peace and warmth. Finally, with the war now ended, first, he saved the old man unconscious in the forest. Second, he neutralized the poison that was devastating Sidrain's body. He could have added the fact that he had to carry the old man unconscious all the way to the annex, but he simply considered that a bonus. Sidrain no longer had any arguments. He was completely and logically defeated. He wondered how such an audacious child could exist in this world. Finally, Sadrain and Dane scheduled their lessons in the training hall. The old man had partially accepted that he might not be able to take Dane as an official disciple, but he could still continue to win the boy over in case he changed his mind in the future. Sadrain simply could not bear to let such have to pay close attention, as the rearrangement code for two-chain magic is much more complicated than one-chain magic. Countless aspiring mages never manage to advance to that stage, and end up giving up. Dane was attentive, grateful to have such an experienced instructor. Saccharine saw the brilliance in the boy's eyes and made sure not to go easy on him. He still had his reputation as an archmage to uphold. After all, two-chain codes are on a completely different level, because the caster must calculate the amount of mana on their own. The magical density in the atmosphere and even the condition of the body play a vital role at the same time. The complicated nature of magic is the reason why most people completely give up on it. Sabrin gave the complex definition, expecting Dane to ask for a simpler explanation. Yet, when he asked the young boy if he needed clarification, Dane simply smiled and let him continue. For Dane, learning not only the rearrangement of magical codes but also information he had never even imagined, was enlightening. To make sure he truly understood the principle, Saccharine asked him to discuss the laws of magical rearrangement. According to the boy's notes, the first law was coexistence. Magical power can exist in the physical world alongside other sources of mana. Through coexistence, mages use both their own power and the ambient magical energy to activate their spells. The second law is conservation. If magical power can accumulate enough elemental material, it can display different attributes through conservation. Dan not only had a deep understanding of the nature of magic, but was also adding his own interpretations. Most people would find magical theory boring, but this was not the case for the young boy. He had talent, tools, and a hunger for knowledge. How could such a perfect candidate for magehood even exist? Continuing the lecture, Saccharine explained that magical codes become exponentially more complicated with each additional chain. Instead of discussing theory, it would be easier to demonstrate. Saccharine carefully summoned a small amount of his mana and created a simple grid of magic to demonstrate a one-chain spell, using the simplest rules. Transformed the fragment of mana into a swirling confusion of runes and power, showing the rearrangement code for two-chain magic. Dane focused intently on the brilliant display, observing how complicated the nodes were. Sadrain manipulated his code and formed a two-chain fire spell, Flame Arrow. When it comes to magical codes, repeated use is the key to mastery. The old man thought that Dane was finally recognizing how complex magic could be. According to his estimate, most people would take at least a year to progress from a one-chain code to a two-chain code. No matter how brilliant someone is, the human mind can only comprehend a portion of the code at a time. Saccharine planned to monitor Dane's progress for about a week while gradually teaching him the technique of mastering two-chain codes. But Dane already wanted to try and Saccharine saw no harm in it. He simply expected the boy to fail miserably. However, when Dane began channeling his mana out of his body to create the first code, it felt as though he was witnessing a master at work. The young boy focused and used his hands to manipulate the pure mana swirling in the air. He finally formed the same grid that Saccharine had demonstrated as the primary form of a chain code. With terrifying precision, the codes were based on defined lines of length and width. The old man was completely astonished, considered an undisputed genius. But where was the fun in that? He went further, deconstructing the mana grid to slowly form a vortex of mana in the air. Saccharine was stunned as he watched a perfect replication of the rearrangement code for the two-chain magic he had only demonstrated once. When asked how he managed to do it so quickly, Dane simply replied that he copied it through observation and memorization of rules and patterns. He visualized every factor in his mind as he formed the magical code, and it came surprisingly easy to him. Saccharine kept being impressed again and again. Even as a magical genius himself, it had taken him time to achieve two-chain magic. Yet a boy without even a magic circle had accomplished it effortlessly in just a few minutes, as if trying to give the old man a heart attack. Dane then declared that he would attempt to use the spell Flame Arrow. Dane made the mana and runes move around his body at impeccable speeds. Finally, he managed to rearrange the code in perfect order to manifest multiple fire arrows. Sakharine stared at the flawlessly created fire arrows, refusing to believe what he was seeing. Watching this boy's abilities was pushing the old man into an existential crisis. If only he had possessed Dane's talent while growing up, he would have long ago achieved his dream of mastering 9 chains. Dane freely controlled the fire arrows, sending them flying throughout the training hall, while the old archmage struggled to compose himself. Even Dane was surprised that it all came to him so naturally at once. One thing was certain, the world would go mad if they saw a mage without a circle performing magical miracles. Sakharine knew that Dane's talent would have to be hidden before all kinds of people with impure intentions tried to approach him. Moreover, he still had not given up on making the boy his disciple. Since Dane assimilated the first code so easily, they could simply continue and learn even more codes. Sakharine thought he might have to be careful with what he included in Dane's recommendation letter for the academy. At the end of the day, Dane lay in bed, reflecting on his magic lesson. He decided to learn properly, both theory and practice. Thinking about his past life, he realized he had been forced into an existence where he did not even have the option to study magic. In circumstances where he never knew when he might die in battle, trying to find time to learn magic had been a luxury he could not afford. He was too busy swinging a sword and struggling to survive. To some extent, magic prioritized theoretical learning over the practical execution of spells. But in this life, he had the time, the resources, and the talent to hunger for much more knowledge. Dane could combine the theory he had learned from Arabella with the innate talent he was born with. And now, with even a bit of proper guidance, he could display explosive growth. Being taught by a former master of the tower, he found himself eager to know what kind of magic he would learn in the coming days. Half a month later, Dane approached his father with a request to make something called a magical reagent. Since they did not have the necessary materials, he would need to leave the territory. His father was a little surprised at his son's progress. Cedrine supported Dane, assuring Count Sogress that the boy was ready for a reagent, now that he had already mastered 4 rearrangement codes. Normally, even geniuses would take a month to learn just one. Count Sogress also understood that magical reagents were difficult to find. Dane had only learned about them while reading books in the family's magical library. Cedrine had long accepted that the boy was simply built differently. He was even glad that Dane was interested in something as tedious as magical reagents. Finally, the Count agreed to the plan, believing this would be a great experience for his son. Since he was leaving, Dane would also get to see more of the territory on his own. He smiled and thanked his father for trusting him to venture out. Dane then departed on a short journey to the outer regions of Sogress territory. At his side were Cedrine and Herman. Even in the outskirts, the people of the county still looked at him and spoke of him with reverence. Dane returned their warm feelings with kindness and a smile. During this journey, Sakharine deduced that Count Sogress must be a benevolent lord, judging by how happy the people were. The south truly had much to offer: delicious snacks, great weather, and good people as well. It was a sight extremely rare to see in the capital, and that was why Dane loved this territory so much. Their small caravan traveled through the outskirts for a while, aiming to reach the magical supply shop. Since Dane had never been to the shop before, he asked Herman to lead the way. The 3 quickened their pace and soon arrived at their destination. The shopkeeper of the magical store was shocked to see the famous young master Dane step into her humble business. She praised his silver hair and striking emerald eyes, and Dane thanked her. Not many people from the fief had been coming to her shop to buy magical supplies lately. Fortunately, she had been able to survive thanks to many foreigners interested in magic. The shopkeeper also recognized Cedrine, the former lord of the magic tower, and expressed her gratitude for having him in her shop. The old man was in good spirits, finally being recognized once more. She invited the pair to browse her products at their leisure and told them to call her if they needed any help. Since it was Dane's first time in a magic shop, Sakharine encouraged him to look around as much as he wanted, while the old man conversed with the merchant. With a quick glance, Dane saw many fascinating things on display: potions, gems, amulets, and all sorts of magical items. Yet he felt a strange sense of déjà vu. He also discovered that touching the products revealed their magical reactions. He simply attributed this to his high affinity and continued exploring. Suddenly a soft chime echoed in his ears as if demanding his attention. He could feel a particularly strong reaction coming from one side of the shop. As he approached that section, the owner informed him that everything on that side was merely decorative items. Meanwhile, Satrine called Dane over to take a look at some potion ingredients together. The old man had already chosen a few raw materials, such as moon root, the owner assured them that her ingredients were personally processed with the highest quality. Meanwhile, Dane was deeply intrigued by the strange sound. As he walked further into the pile of decorations, he felt a strange power calling to him. He turned and saw a piece of stone that emitted pure mana. It must have also been the source of the sound. Dane hurried toward the stone, as if his body were moving on its own. Herman, seeing his young master behaving oddly, rushed to him in concern. To Herman, his young master was simply staring at an ordinary rock stuck into the wall as decoration. Dane wasn't sure what was happening, but the stone was undeniably calling to him. He pulled it out of the wall and held it in his hands. As he suspected, imbuing the stone with more magic made the reaction even stronger. There was a possibility that the object was reacting uniquely to his magic. Meanwhile, the old Sadrine was still busy gathering raw ingredients. Dane went to the shop owner and asked about the history of the stone he had just taken from the wall. As she had said before, it was only decoration. But what kind of decoration had a magical reaction stronger than anything else in the shop? Sadrine asked the owner if she might have been tricked with the stone. She admitted that several years ago a traveling merchant had given her a large bundle as payment. When she eagerly opened it, she found only this plain-looking stone inside. She had held onto it, hoping it might be valuable, and even asked a mage to evaluate the stone, but it had been confirmed to be nothing more than an ordinary rock. Based on Dane's interaction with it, however, it was clearly not a normal stone. The owner insisted that the young master should focus on her other products and some special magical artifacts instead of wasting time with a rock. She tried to sell him many valuable magical artifacts of all kinds, but Dane was still captivated by the strange stone in his hand. It was the only thing he wanted. She even showed him a name scroll card that could automatically read and store all types of information for cataloging. In the end, Dane purchased both the scroll and the useless stone. He was certain this was not an object he could simply leave behind. Even Sadrain was confused about what was going through the boy's mind. On the journey back, the old mage asked curiously if Dane had developed an interest in decorative art, or if he truly believed there was something special about the stone. When Dane explained that the slab was reacting to his magic, Saccharine kept an open mind. Although he did not see anything special in it, his curiosity was certainly piqued. Since there were many people on the streets, the small caravan hurried back to the castle. Saccharine then set up an invaluable experimental device to help Dane uncover what the stone really was. He was confident he could evaluate the stone with precision. Still, a mage had already appraised it once and found nothing notable. Saccharine arrogantly declared that no mage appraiser was better than his tool. He had invested all of his resources into this state-of-the-art device for evaluations. He was confident he could analyze anything placed upon it. Both were eager to see what was special about the seemingly ordinary slab of stone. Saccharine placed the object on the platform and instructed Dane to imbue it with his magic to stimulate a reaction. When Dane did exactly that, the stone immediately began radiating an intensely dense flow of magical power. It lit up within the evaluation device, its brilliance swirling and forming something complex. Saccharine carefully monitored the burst of light, keeping his eyes on the stone slab. As his tool successfully revealed the mystery within the stone, Saccharine finally felt like he could hold his head high again after being humiliated by the boy so many times. The mana from the slab danced around the room, forming runes in the air. Dane immediately understood what they were seeing since he had been studying such things with Saccharine for weeks. Inside the stone was a magical code, but the old archmage declared it was not just any code, it was extraordinary. Floating around them was a code whose structure, arrangement, and complexity had never been seen before. It could be as complex as a 6-chain or even a 7-chain code. Thus the magical stone contained a hidden code, and Dane's magic seemed to be the key to unlocking it. The stone only responded to his mana. Of course, they had managed to extract the code, but deciphering what it was and why it only reacted to Dane's magic was an entirely different challenge. Even Sidrin, who was well versed in the magical arts, was unfamiliar with this particular type of magic, but his pride as a mage drove him to determine its secrets. If he could succeed, they might discover what made Dane's magic so unique. While Dane and Sidrin worked tirelessly to decipher the magic in the Sogress training grounds, Arabella was busy conducting her own research in her personal laboratory at the academy. Her lab was filled with books and artifacts carefully organized from her many studies. Arabella had stored her younger brother's mana signature inside a magic stone and had confirmed that there was indeed something unusual about Dane's power. His magic had a distinct characteristic that did not correspond to any known form of magic. She had performed countless tests and studied numerous research papers, yet she still could not identify which magical field this anomaly belonged to. And yet nothing revealed an answer. Still, she was convinced that the truth was hidden somewhere. Then she suddenly remembered hearing about a long-lost field of magic that had disappeared from the magical world. Perhaps Dennis's magic was connected to that forgotten domain. Arabella began digging through her mountains of books and literature, trying to recall where she had stored that old tome. It was a book that discussed alchemy, divination, spiritualism, necromancy, and a primitive form of magical coding. As she searched excitedly, another dusty volume fell from the shelves. She picked it up and realized it was an ancient book of magic. Thinking it over, she remembered that she had once studied the vanished magical realm of Agrick, a civilization said to have existed more than 2,000 years ago, and inherited ancient magic from an even earlier era. It was said to have practiced forms of magic that no longer existed. Arabella laughed to herself, dismissing the idea. Ancient magic had vanished long ago. There was no way Dennis's magic could be tied to such a relic of the past. But at this point, she had nothing to lose. So she decided to try something unconventional. She placed the magic crystal containing Dane mana into her magical typewriter and cross-referenced it with the ancient book of magic. After a few moments of concentration, Arabella opened her eyes in shock. The crystal was reacting. Quickly, she jotted down notes, her mind racing as she wondered if Dane's magic could be linked to alchemy, divination, or something completely different. Arabella would be fine with any result as long as it wasn't necromancy. When she finished analyzing her findings, she felt as though she had been struck by lightning. All she could say was, "What kind of discovery is this?" Back at the Sogress training grounds, Dane and Sidrin were still working hard, trying to provoke more reactions from the stone. After some time, Sidrin finally managed to break the seal on the slab. Inside it was something else. Another object. The old man carefully reached in and pulled it out. It was a simple accessory, a silver bracelet that radiated a dense magical power. To the untrained eye, it looked like nothing more than an ordinary bracelet one might find in a market. Sidrin initially thought there might be something special about the material of the bracelet, but it appeared common. Since the stone had only responded to Dane's mana, Sidrin suspected the same would happen with the bracelet. Dane slipped the bracelet onto his wrist. At first it dangled loosely, far too large for him, but then the reaction came. The bracelet lit up, resonating with the magic flowing through his body. As expected, it responded only to him. Strange characters began to emerge from the bracelet, glowing without him realizing. Sidrin leaned closer to see more clearly, while Dane eagerly asked if the old mage could decipher the symbols. To Dane's surprise, Sidrin's face lit up with a wide smile. They were ancient runes, characters that no one in the current world could read. By ancient, Sidrin meant the language of the lost kingdom of Arcana. Dane knew little of Arcana, aside from what Arabella had told him when they were children. She had described it as an age when magic dominated every aspect of life, but then suddenly and mysteriously, that era of magical prosperity had ended, leaving behind only relics and legends. And now this strange line of magical code sealed inside a stone had been added to the ancient puzzle. Sidrin already knew Dane's magic was special, but he had never imagined it would be linked to the ancient kingdom of Arcana. This revelation only deepened his desire to take Dane as his apprentice. After all, It was said that the forest of the last days, which had once defeated even Cedrine, was infused with remnants of Arcaana's disruptive magic. Dane's connection to that ancient power now made sense. Unfortunately, all they had for now were those few indecipherable lines of text runes. Cedrine urged Dane to take all the time he needed to delve deeper into the mystery, but he also warned him to keep it a secret for the time being. Suddenly, their quiet study was interrupted. A terrifying sound echoed throughout the Sogress territory, making both of their eyes widen in alarm. Something horrible was approaching. The familiar sound of the alarm caught them off guard, and the old mage quickly realized it must be the signal for a monster attack. For Cedrine, that was more than enough to excite him. Now that his body was nearly fully healed, he was eager to stretch his old muscles and get his blood pumping. Besides, this was a great opportunity to repay the hospitality of the Sogress family. With a grin, the old man quickly told Dane not to just stand there but to grab a spear or something. Yet Dane simply stood motionless, his face calm and expressionless. Silently, he slipped his hand inside his coat and pulled out a pendant. Cedrine raised a brow and asked what he was holding, and why the sound of the monster alarm seemed to be coming from it. Dane then revealed to the excited old mage that the sound had nothing to do with monsters. In fact, it meant that his older sister was trying to contact him. The old man's excitement deflated like a popped balloon when he realized the situation, and he grumbled at Dane for not mentioning it earlier. Dane only laughed awkwardly, reminding him that it went without saying. There was no reason for monsters to appear in this area. With that cleared up, Dane decided to answer his sister's call while the old mage stood there with a disappointed expression. As soon as the connection formed, his sister immediately asked why it had taken him so long to respond. He simply apologized and asked her the reason for the call. She began to reveal some interesting details about his magical code, but quickly cut herself off, asking if someone was with him. The mere mention of the magical code was enough for Dane to realize that she had discovered the truth, that his magic was in fact ancient magic. The old man, overhearing, let out a sharp cry of disbelief and demanded to know how she had figured it out. As they continued talking, Dane explained his side of the story, that when he and Cedrine had been analyzing the stones, they too had discovered that his magic belonged to the ancient realm. They realized this because the stone only reacted to his mana, which was proof enough. The old mage, however, ground his teeth in sheer frustration. The fact that she had uncovered the same truth just by analyzing Dane's mana was insane. He knew she was a genius, but her talent was proving to be far greater than he had imagined. Arabelle then asked her brother if anyone else knew about his secret. Dane quickly answered no. She sighed in relief and told both Dane and Cedrine to keep this matter hidden. If word of his secret spread, he would not be able to handle the consequences. She then politely apologized to Cedrine for not introducing herself before diving the matter. The old man only laughed, saying he already knew plenty about her through Dan. As for keeping Dan's magic a secret, he assured her that he would not allow a single soul to learn of it. If such information were to leak, not only would Dan be in danger, but the entire Sogress household would suffer the consequences. Arbella praised him for immediately understanding the severity of the situation, something to be expected from the wise Cedrine. The old mage then asked if the conversation was being recorded. Arabella replied that it was not, adding that once the call ended, it would be deleted immediately. It was good news. At least they didn't have to worry about leaks. Cedrine then revealed that he also intended to return to the magic tower to investigate this matter. Arabella thanked him for the gesture, but he waved it off, insisting that as a mage, he was only fulfilling his duty and there was no need for her to feel indebted. Speaking of the magic tower, he mentioned he had heard she was looking to join one and asked if she had decided which to choose. Arbella immediately realized he was hinting at his own tower and tried to avoid the question by saying she wasn't considering the Nixon Tower of Magic because it didn't specialize in her area of interest. Naturally, this irritated the old man once more. He had already wondered where Dane's intelligence came from, and it was becoming clear that he had inherited it from his sister. Still, Cedrine did not voice his frustration. Instead, he chuckled, saying she didn't need to join their magic tower after all. Meanwhile, Dan felt slightly uneasy watching the exchange, especially since his sister had spoken so bluntly. Regardless, she decided to end the conversation by saying they could discuss the details later. After exchanging farewells, she ended the connection. Sadrine commented on how impressive Dan's sister had become, to which Dan agreed, mentioning that the artifact in front of them had also been crafted by her. He added that this compact crystal orb was popular among young mages. The old man smiled and admitted it was impressive, though his face betrayed a trace of frustration as he said he had no need for such an item. He explained that once a mage reached the 8th chain, wasting time talking to people was not something they did. Dane quickly understood what he meant. The fact that the old man didn't want a trendy item like this only suggested that he didn't have any friends. Later, Dane told his parents everything about the ancient magic. His mother seemed deeply worried upon hearing it, but his father reassured them, saying that if anyone targeted Dane, they would make sure those responsible paid the price. His mother agreed, declaring that she would never hesitate when it came to protecting her son. Once again, Dane felt a little uncomfortable with their intense protective instincts, but he had to admit that there was nothing safer than being under their care. His father then pointed out that if what Dane said was true, it meant their bloodline carried latent ancient magic. His wife acknowledged this and wondered aloud if any of their ancestors had possessed it. She decided to look into her side of the family. The thought was intriguing, and Dane couldn't help but wonder what might be discovered if both sides of the family investigated. Though it wasn't of real importance to him, his curiosity was stirred nonetheless. Either way, his mother reminded him that he had already pushed past his limits in many ways. If he continued down this path, it might interfere with his growth. Therefore, he should consider slowly preparing to head to the capital. The mention of the capital surprised him, and his parents reminded him that he needed to be at least 14 years old to enter the academy. Now that he had reached that age, there was no reason to delay any longer. Count Sogress made it clear that he had hoped to keep Dane for another year or two before sending him away, but it seemed there was nothing more for him to learn here. His mother placed her hand gently over his, reassuring him that he could leave whenever he wished, emphasizing that the decision was entirely his. Dane was surprised to hear this, as he hadn't expected them to so readily accept the fact that he needed to leave. His father expressed confidence that his son would make him proud and encouraged him to go and make the most of his talents. Dane smiled at their words, promising that he would prepare himself to enter the academy. The family of 3 shared a warm smile as the decision was finalized, and now Dane too felt excited to move on to the next stage of his life. Later, Dane informed Sadrine of his decision to leave the mansion. The old mage asked if he had truly chosen to depart, and Dane confirmed it, though he admitted it was a little earlier than he had originally planned. The old man expressed his support, saying it would be a waste of potential to keep Dane's talents confined here. He also offered some advice not to reveal too much of his ability all at once to others. While the academy welcomed talent, not everyone viewed it kindly, and some might become envious. Dane was already aware of this, as Arabella had warned him about the absurd situations she herself had faced. The old mage added that it was difficult for mediocre students to thrive in the academy, but reassured him that the Termine household was certainly not one of mediocrity. Speaking of the Termians reminded Dane of Ladin, a promise he had made to visit her as soon as he reached the capital. He knew that if he failed to do so, she would be deeply disappointed. He also remembered the crest given to him by Duke Termian and resolved to think carefully about the type of weapon he wanted before visiting them. Sadrine reminded him that there were still 3 months before he officially entered the academy, so he should plan to depart in 2. Dane acknowledged this, then turned the question back, asking about the old man's own plans. Sadrine replied that he would return to the magic tower as there was something he needed to resolve. He expressed his gratitude to Dane for helping him overcome his boredom, and as a gesture of goodwill promised to share any clues he discovered regarding ancient magic. Dane was deeply grateful for this. Sadrine then pointed out that with only a short time left here, lessons should be Dane's primary focus. He could accelerate the process to finish earlier, but warned that the 3rd chain was significantly more difficult than the 2nd. Dane promised to study diligently to reach that level. Dane then mentioned he had prepared a gift for the old mage. Sadrine perked up, clearly curious about what it might be. Dane promptly pulled out a box and explained that he had received it yesterday from his sister via teleportation magic. It was, he said, a very popular item among young people at the moment, and this particular model was a new compact crystal orb that hadn't even been released yet. Arabella herself had developed it, and he had pulled a few strings to obtain one as a favor. The old mage eagerly snatched up the orb, looking absolutely delighted to have it in his hands. He marveled at its beauty. Though he insisted he didn't need such a thing, he graciously accepted the gift Dane had prepared. Regardless of his denial, the expression on his face made it obvious that he was thrilled to own the item. Dane then spent time explaining to the old man how to use the crystal, much like a teenager teaching his grandmother how to use a new device. As night fell and he returned to his room, he reflected on how much he had to accomplish in the 2 months remaining. He revealed that his main interest lay in summoning, thus he decided that his goal would be to officially take summoning lessons, receive a summoning sigil, and have the chance to attempt the qualification exam. Since Claire was an assistant instructor, he was hopeful he might see her frequently during his lessons. Speaking of summoning, he suddenly remembered that he had nearly forgotten to imbue his familiar with magic. Quickly he retrieved the egg and transferred a bit of his mana into it. For 7 years Dane had faithfully infused the egg with magic every morning and night, though it had yet to respond. Still, since the mana he provided wasn't dispersing elsewhere and was being absorbed by the familiar, he was certain the egg would hatch someday. The next scene shifted to the academy, where students were discussing the admission exams, which were divided into 2 parts, a common exam and a specialization exam. The common exam served as a preparatory test, focusing on insight into